2 weeks of forced inactivity left me considerably more agitated than I had been expecting. The old medic who'd patched me up in his basement clinic after my confrontation with the gangsters at the Rising Suns building had said I was welcome to come back in 3 weeks' time to pay him to take the stitches out, provided I kept the wound clean and babied my arm and my side until then. At the time, I had been eager for the opportunities presented by almost a month of medically required downtime. Now, I could only blame the blood loss for my foolish thoughts at the time. The silver lining of sustaining a grazing bullet wound had proven remarkably transient. The initial joy at escaping death and shock at having avoided major injury, customary after many near-death experiences, faded before the medic had even finished stitching up my arm. After so many brushes with death in both this life and the last, the emotional reaction to survival felt somewhat muted. The secondary joy at having a cast-iron reason to excuse myself from active operations in favor of more managerial tasks, which would not only benefit the Kozuki organization and Rising Sun, but would also further showcase my talents as a non-combat asset, took longer to fade. Indeed, it hadn't faded, in that I was still happy for the time and opportunities presented by my injury, but that the joy at the opening on my schedule had been eclipsed by two sources of unexpected frustration: my need for physical activity, and Ogi's inspired impression of a mother hen. Years of constant hard work on the streets of Shinjuku, and months of training to try and prepare my scrawny body for the fighting sure to come, had accustomed me to near constant physical activity. Admittedly, it had also accustomed me to hanging on the ragged edge of starved exhaustion as well, but the point stood. Between the increased caloric intake of my shared meals with Ogi, plus the snacks that everybody just seemed to happen to have on hand whenever they visited me in the apartment, and the enforced rest so I could recuperate, I felt energized to the point of bursting. My hands twitched, and I found myself taking every excuse that came my way to stand up and pace around the studio's single room. I could feel Ogi's smirk as I paced, and my cheeks burnt as I imagined the easy comparisons he was making between my current behavior and that of a lazy student trying to evade her homework, but at least he was kind enough to not twist the knife by vocalizing such comparisons. Instead, he confined himself to constantly asking if I was hungry, if my wounds were itching, or if I needed anything. The overly solicitous behavior was a bit much, but in line with what I had come to expect from the man. Irritating as it was, I found I couldn't quite get angry with Ogi about his concern. It was touching, I suppose, that he was so obviously worried about me. That said, I'd been injured far worse in my previous life multiple times, most notably in the skies over Norden, and while I lacked the magical advantages that had made it so easy to block out pain before, a grazing wound was nothing compared to the injuries sustained in that little dust-up. I couldn't exactly convey that to him, however, not without either telling him about my past life or lying about some fictitious injury sustained before I'd met him. In the end I resolved to simply enjoy the novel experience of being fussed over. After all, trust was difficult to build and easy to lose, and Ogi had quite clearly decided to trust in me. It would have been a remarkably unfair trade if I decided to repay that trust with lies, especially over something so petty. Plus, I lacked any scars to back up a story of a past injury. Fortunately, the minor inconveniences of my injuries aside, the last 2 weeks had brought nothing but good news for the Rising Sun, and for the Kozuki organization. Apparently, the way I had handled the gangster incursion had overly impressed the Shinjuku citizens attending the dinner. I suppose I could understand. I had managed to deal with the gangsters relatively easily, and displays of strength, no matter how minor, always drew the desperate like moths to the flame. To my pleasant surprise, my attempt to salvage and preserve perfectly usable human resources from the situation appeared to have been equally if not more impressive, although it had been at least partially misunderstood. The Rising Sun Benevolent Association was suddenly awash with volunteers, old and young, all eager to help the Shinjuku community while happily spouting off about my mercy and compassion for all suffering Japanese. It was somewhat alarming how quickly my hasty words, "All are welcome under the light of the rising sun," had taken on something of a life of their own. According to gossip passed on by Naoto and Ogi, red circles with the kanji for light superimposed had begun to appear on walls across Shinjuku the night after the community dinner. While I was not a fan of graffiti personally, only a fool ignored it in Shinjuku. From gang tags splashed across walls to calls to murder Britannians to more earthy expressions, graffiti was the anonymous expression of sentiment in the meager public spaces. In a very real way, Graffiti truly was the heartbeat of the city, and provided an insight into the minds of the inhabitants of the ghetto. If Naoto and Ogi were correct about how widespread and spontaneous the signs of support were, the spectacle must have been far more impressive than I had imagined. Beyond rising suns sprayed on concrete and the sudden willingness of Shinjuku citizens to help each other, the rising sun had also received a slightly more official vote of confidence in the form of recognition from what passed for local government. The functional anarchy of Shinjuku was a product of grassroots organizations that had sprung up in the post-conquest chaos to try and provide a basic level of social organization and services. Some of those organizations were, admittedly, gangs trying to exert their dominance over the territory they controlled and clamping down on any crime not committed by themselves, but the majority were ad hoc public safety committees. These groups of self-organized citizens generally held sway over a block, a street, or a tenement, and organized things such as childcare and rubble and trash clearing in their area. These committees had been my primary employers during my years of working for my dinner, and ranged from petty tyrannies to remarkably well-organized attempts at self-governance. Now, in the wake of the events at the Rising Sun building 2 weeks ago, several of the safety committees had sent representatives to meet with Ogi and myself, asking for alliances to share resources and to provide mutual aid. Typically, these appeals were dressed up in language about helping the collective good of Shinjuku and the like, and in some cases the representatives actually seemed sincere about seeking the best for their constituents, but I could easily read between the lines of their requests for alliance. The committees had seen the rising threat of the spiraling gang war, and had recognized the need to reassert order on the ghetto. When I had publicly defied the attempt by a gang to usurp control over the Rising Sun's resources, I had unintentionally thrown down a public gauntlet, something that the committees had been waiting for someone to do. Now they were rallying behind the Rising Sun as silent partners. If the gangs decided to respond in force, the committees would undoubtedly hastily disassociate from our efforts, but if we could take the initiative, they would provide us with resources and manpower. Fortunately for the forces of order in Shinjuku, Naoto had already begun to move against the gangs before the first committee had sent a representative to ask for a meeting with me. Correctly deducing that no gang would allow such a public slap in the face to go unanswered, Naoto had masterfully utilized newly acquired human resources and milked the new recruits for every detail he could about the operations of their former gang. Apparently, it had been a fairly small operation, centered around a core of former Kokirikai members and an underboss from the now-defunct gang, and only in control of a small amount of territory close to the Rising Sun building. This splinter gang operated a minor amphetamine production and distribution operation, as well as a pair of decidedly low-class brothels, and Hojo in particular had been happy to give Naoto the locations of every gang asset he'd known about. As a result of this wealth of intelligence, Naoto's opening salvo had been remarkably effective. Leaving Tamaki in charge of handling the recruits' training, Naoto had taken Chihiro and Suichiro and had begun a decapitating assassination campaign. With Hojo's information about the locations of all of the gang's safe houses and operational facilities in hand, hunting down the gang's leadership had been relatively easy. Naoto took the opportunity to finally put those Britannian assault rifles I'd acquired during my truck hijacking months ago to use, and had successfully ambushed the gang's boss and 3 of his inner circle as they'd left the gang's hidden meth lab the afternoon following the incident at the Rising Sun. The resulting hail of gunfire had wiped out all 4 of the targets present, plus their bodyguards, and Naoto had personally confirmed their deaths by shooting each corpse in the head afterwards. After that, Naoto had led Suichiro and Chihiro to the gang's brothels and freed the captive women inside, and had let Chihiro and the newly freed slaves handle whichever guards had survived the initial assaults. Apparently, the resulting reprisal of the knife and hammer-wielding women had been extremely passionate, and Naoto had still been splattered with blood when he'd returned to the apartment to update Ogi and I on his progress. While the execution of captives was deplorable, as was the waste of human resources, I could only applaud Naoto's decision to hand vengeance over to those most brutally oppressed by the gang. It had been an excellent decision, from the point of view of realpolitik. Unless Naoto had planned to defend his prisoners' lives by force, after what Chihiro at the very least had seen inside the squalid rooms of the brothel, those men were already dead. By deliberately handing them over to Chihiro and the formerly enslaved women, He had successfully changed the narrative from uncontrollable soldiers' mutiny against their officer to lynch prisoners to outraged officer gives victims a chance for justice against their rapists, making himself appear to be the gracious and caring leader the Japanese hungered for. Besides, if I'd been there myself, I'd have made sure they died slowly. As a result of Naoto's aggressive campaign, the gang that had first menaced the Rising Sun was dispersed, their assets and territory now ours by the right of conquest, and our pool of recruits and supplies expanded. I didn't delude myself into thinking that this early success indicated that rolling over the rest of the gangs that riddled Shinjuku would be equally easy. We'd had the advantage of insider intelligence on our side, and thanks to Naoto's efforts to ensure the first trio of gangsters had completely disappeared, the element of surprise as well. Either would have been a luxury, but both had practically paved the road to victory for Naoto. Still, it had been an early and obvious success, and probably more than my minor victory in the Rising Sun building proved our strength to the committees. When they came to build alliances with us, they did so both because of our sudden public appeal and because of the row of bloodied yellow scarfs Naoto had nailed to the wall of one of the former brothels. While we had not, of course, publicly claimed responsibility for the sudden disintegration of the gang, since no simple charity and community-building organization would involve itself in such violence, the affiliation of the masked gunman who had assassinated the gang's leader was obvious to everybody in our corner of Shinjuku. Naoto hadn't stopped to rest on his laurels after the initial wave of success. Gangsters affiliated with multiple other gangs had vanished at night while out singly or in pairs, and no identifiable corpses had been found, though the alleys of Shinjuku contained slightly more grisly bundles than normal. Several of the more obvious gang hideouts in areas of Shinjuku further away from the Rising Sun had been Molotoved, and in the one operation Tamaki had been allowed to participate in, one of the rocket-propelled grenades Naoto had somehow gotten his hands on had been fired through the door of a garage-turned-meth lab. The resulting fireball had immolated the entire structure and everybody inside, but fortunately had represented such an escalation in violence that nobody had blamed us for it, and instead the gangs had doubled down on their internecine conflict. Overall, I couldn't have been more proud of Naoto. When I had first realized how green the Kozuki organization was, I had been afraid that I'd hooked my wagon to a doomed star, and that Naoto's lack of real-world leadership experience would doom us all. Fortunately, when push had come to shove, he'd rapidly proven to have the intelligence, insight, and ruthless streak necessary to lead. Ogi had really stepped up his leadership ability too, in the recent weeks. His efforts to reach out to every member of the organization after the station mission had begun to crystallize his role as the human resources chief in the organization, and he'd continued to operate splendidly in that role as more recruits had filtered in. After Naoto had freed the captives of the gang brothels, several of the newly freed women had asked to join the organization for one reason or another, and of course thanks to the all are welcome under the light of the Rising Sun motto, they'd been welcomed with open arms. That had almost led to an unfortunate incident when they'd been introduced to our other new recruits, but happily none of the four had been directly involved in the brothel operations, and so Ogi had managed to talk everybody down. Once the knives had been put away and the guns holstered, Ogi had managed to work out an understanding between the former gangsters and the former victims. One of the former slaves had been unable to continence working alongside the former gangsters, and so Ogi had shifted her to the Rising Sun side of the operation, tasking her with helping Ino keep things running. I couldn't have handled that whole situation any better myself, and I'd told Ogi so after he'd returned. He'd looked pleasantly surprised by that, which was gratifying. It was always important to reinforce success with encouragement, and the fact that he looked so pleased emphasized that he considered my judgment important. Quite a difference from so many superiors I'd had in my first 2 lives. It had been mildly discouraging when I realized that I was perhaps not as necessary to the Kozuki organization as I had been before the attack on the weapons market in the subway station. Naoto was doing a splendid job directing combat operations, and Ogi was managing complex and touchy personnel issues with aplomb. It felt good to see them start to grow into their potential. After all, the goal of any good human resources manager was always to develop and nurture talent, but I had begun to worry that my value to the group was diminishing. I'd tried to assist Tamaki with the training program, reasoning that a larger pool of recruits necessitated more instructors to maximize the efficacy of the training, but I'd been roundly rebuffed by both Tamaki and Ogi and all but ordered by Naoto to continue resting. So, I'd instead turned to Ino, and helped her efforts to both coordinate the many humanitarian projects of the Rising Sun and to determine targets for Naoto to strike. It wasn't as direct of a way of demonstrating my continuing worth as joining Naoto on the nighttime streets in a balaclava, but sifting through intelligence and planning out attack strategies was unarguably a greater service to the cause than just being another soldier. Safer, too. Just a pity that sitting down and calmly planning out the next move didn't do anything to reduce my restlessness. A week after the dinner at the Rising Sun, Nagata and Ogi successfully negotiated an introduction to the 6 houses of Kyoto from Mr. Asahara. The shrewd old bastard had negotiated a generous administrative fee for his services as a middleman, but had allegedly given a virtuous customer discount to us in light of the events at the Rising Sun, which he had of course heard about from someone or another. He'd also, apparently, been very impressed with the use we'd put his products to in the station mission, and had extended both his compliments and a discount on the purchase of future explosive devices, contingent on the continued use of his work for virtuous purposes. I had my doubts about his sincerity, since to my eyes Mr. Asahara appeared to be a consummate survivor and a professional at being on the winning side, but if he was willing to give us a discount on future bomb purchases, that in itself was another vote of confidence. If the wily old engineer thought we were on the right path, I'd hoped that he would pass that impression on to the 6 houses. Finally, after a week of anxiously waiting on word from the enigmatic cabal of plutocrats, a meeting had been scheduled with a representative from Kyoto. The representative had opted to meet with us well outside of our territory in Shinjuku, and had given an address of a restaurant in one of the honorary Britannian districts as the meeting location. I couldn't fault the abundance of caution displayed by the group. In their line of business, discretion was undoubtedly the better part of valor, and so soon Ogi and I found ourselves in one of the seedier parts of the concession, not too far from Shinjuku itself. I wonder if the zoning is purely to remind the honorary Britannians of their place, or if it's just that the proximity to the ghetto brings down property values enough to be affordable to honorary Britannians. Ogi was dressed as a servant, in a moderately nice suit with his usual pompadour combed flat, while I wore a nice blouse and jacket combination I'd allowed Callan to bully me into letting her buy for me once she'd gotten wind of this meeting. Together, we hopefully looked like a precocious middle-class Britannian girl having a bit of an adventure by visiting the honorary Britannian district, with a long-suffering honorary Britannian servant forced into acting as my minder. Unfortunately, Ogi spoke almost no Britannian, which would have made the whole charade untenable, but thanks to the many trips to the Tokyo settlement I'd taken with Callan over the last month, my Britannian had significantly improved. While traces of my Germanian accent still lingered, they weren't enough to immediately make me sound like a foreigner. In addition, my insistence that Callan only speak to me in Britannian during our trips through the settlement had considerably expanded my vocabulary, not only in terms of the proper expressions but also in the all-important field of slang. If anybody tried to talk to Ogi, I could just play the part of the pain-in-the-ass Britannian kid and force my way into the conversation. The restaurant was an example of Britannian-style dining, according to the sign on the door, and to my eyes appeared like a cross between the family-style restaurants of the Japan of my first life, and an English pub I had visited once at the insistence of my boss. The Britannian flag and the imperial coat of arms were everywhere, from the flags draped over the counter to the numerous framed photographs of Britannian and honorary Britannian soldiers in triumphant poses. Apparently, this establishment catered to soldiers, as a small sign by the register promised a 20% discount to any uniformed service personnel. Fortunately, the restaurant was nearly empty at 2 in the afternoon, a group of street cleaners in overalls clustered in a booth being the only customers aside from a tired-looking young man in a worn yet clean and neatly pressed suit. As we entered the restaurant, the tired man slowly looked up from his plate of fried fish and potatoes and nodded at us, before returning his attention to his cod. I gestured for Ogi to join the man at the table before making my way to the counter and ordering for both of us. I was disheartened but not surprised that the menu completely lacked any sort of Japanese cuisine, and resigned myself to another temporary return to the Western-style food of my second life. After ordering a meat pie for Ogi and a serving of bangers and mash for myself, purposefully ignoring the host's offer of a children's menu, I made my way over to the table where Ogi and the representative sat in uneasy silence. As I dropped down into my seat, I weighed my options. I could follow in Ogi's steps and simply sit silently until the representative spoke first, making him start the conversation and thus take the position of the supplicant. Alternatively, Since Ogi showed no signs of speaking and since the conversation would probably have to be carried out in Britannian lest we draw attention for speaking in a taboo language in an honorary Britannian establishment, I could start the conversation, thus seizing the initiative. I'd played chess occasionally, never enough to be particularly good at it, but enough to understand the basics of the game. It was, after all, one of the most commonly used visual metaphors when it came to negotiation or strategy of any kind, so it would have been foolish to attend the War College of a major European power without at least basic familiarity with the game. I understood the argument that black has an inherent advantage by dint of conceding the first move to white, and thus having the luxury of reacting instead of acting. That said, one of the many lessons I'd learned both climbing the corporate ladder and trying to survive the largest war to ever blemish the face of that world was that taking the initiative was the key to success. If I hadn't taken the initiative to enlist in the army and had instead waited to be drafted, I doubted I would have enjoyed such a rapid trip up the table of ranks. If I hadn't taken the initiative and pushed Youjo towards the logistics core, he might have proven to be serious competition for my advancement. Instead, we'd both profited, as I'd gained a valuable ally and he'd gained a respectable career in a safe detachment. If I hadn't taken the initiative and presented myself as a serious and intelligent recruit to Ogi and Naoto within the first day of knowing them, I would have had a hard time convincing them to take me seriously later on. I always played white. How was the trip in from Kyoto? I've heard plenty of wonderful things about the new Maglev line, such an example of the many improvements brought to Area 11. It was always tricky, initiating a new business relationship, especially when the person on the other side of the table is a complete stranger. A little small talk to break the ice and get the conversation rolling seemed like the safest option. To his credit, the man from Kyoto seemed entirely unsurprised for the younger of his conversational partners to be taking the lead on the conversation. Not even a momentary flicker of surprise was evident on his face as he carefully nodded, daubing a bit of grease from his fish away from his mouth. Either he's naturally phlegmatic, or somebody briefed him in advance. Yes, quite. I'm sure it will make the transportation of merchandise to the Kanto region far simpler in the coming months. He gave me a bland, empty smile that meant nothing at all. You come quite highly recommended, Miss Hawthorne. According to our contact, you have proven yourself to be quite the dynamo of late. I'm happy you were able to take time out of your busy schedule to meet with me. Hawthorne? I suppose using Hajime would be a bad move here. Wonder if he came up with it himself, or was it Mr. Asahara's doing? It's no problem. I smiled back, equally blandly, and idly gestured at Ogi. I'm lucky to have quite a few well-trained and intelligent subordinates, and you know how hard it is to find good help these days. It's always important to share credit where it's due, even if the recipient can't understand what you're currently saying. Plus, no need to come off as some kind of prima donna. I needed to appear to be a good and reliable partner. Besides, I would hate to make you or your home office feel slighted. I'm quite eager to expand our operations, and your help would be instrumental in accelerating that process. The meaningless smile returned, just as empty as ever. Regrettably, there is a slight issue with your application. While your ability to inspire confidence and handle domestic competition has been superb thus far, your organization has shown a distinctly lackluster degree of enthusiasm when it comes to reaching out into foreign markets. The professional smile beneath the representative's weary eyes appeared to gain a degree of smugness, but it was impossible to nail down the exact micro-expression that conveyed the implied message of superiority and thus take offense. Nonetheless, it was clear this smug collaborator was looking down at me. Until you managed to shore up that portion of your portfolio and display concrete achievements when it comes to the Britannian market, I'm afraid we cannot provide material support, much less investment. Fucking damn it. In an instant, the meeting had gone from promising to horrible. I should have known just focusing on the gangs would come back to bite me. It was suddenly clear to me, the Six Houses backed anti-Britannian groups, not just armed groups in general. By focusing my initial efforts on cleaning up Shinjuku, I'd inadvertently signaled that our group was purely focused on internal matters. Damn it, don't these old men understand how important it is to build up a power base before picking a fight with a global empire? Even as I fumed, I knew it didn't matter. The oligarchs in Kyoto had all the power in this exchange, and the price for access to their resources and support was dead Britannians, and I didn't even bring a single Britannian casualty to the table. Fuck, Mr. Asahara must have really talked me up for them to have met with me at all. Even as I internally panicked, I maintained my calm exterior, smile and all. When negotiating, no matter how dear your situation, you must never show weakness. After all, I understand your organization's concern, though I am very sorry to hear it. Are there any specific export quotas we must meet, or priority targets you wish us to achieve, before I can convince you to reconsider your stance on my group? I was foolish. I didn't ask Asahara what the 6 houses would specifically want before asking him to contact them. Best to just get their demands straight from the horse's mouth while the representative is here. To my irritation, the tired man seated across the cheap formica table simply shrugged, the galling smile still smeared across his baggy face. Nothing in particular comes to mind. Just show some results, make it nice and public, and make sure it's in the foreign sector. Use your imagination. According to our contact, you've got plenty of that, Miss Hawthorne. If you actually manage to achieve anything, well, that damned smile seemed to grow another inch, and the lips rotated in slightly, baring his teeth at me in a condescending gesture of amusement. Don't call us, we'll call you. Maybe we'll decide to invest in your little company after all. And with that, he popped the last bite of his fried fish in his mouth, stood up, dropped his napkin on the plate, and left. The entire meeting had been, start to finish, just under 5 minutes. Ogi and I hadn't even gotten our meals yet. Ogi watched the man from Kyoto leave, and then turned to me and summed up the entire situation in one of the few Britannian phrases he'd picked up from Naoto. Well, fuck. Naoto was irritated, but unsurprised, to hear the outcome of our meeting with the Kyoto House representative. They're supposed to be pretty choosy. He shrugged as he took the kettle off the hot plate and poured hot water into 3 cups, drowning the tea bags contained within. It's annoying, but it's their money, so guess it's up to us to meet their demands. I suppose you are correct, I sighed, and accepted a cup from Naoto. I guess the armed insurrectionist market is just like every other part of a free economy, in that the customer is always right. It was galling to admit, but there was no point in trying to deny the obvious. We lacked any leverage over the 6 houses to compel them to commit resources to our organization, which meant we'd have to concede a degree of autonomy and give them a stake in our decision-making process to secure backing. That said, I think all of us were expecting something along these lines. Rich men, after all, don't stay rich by just giving money away without getting something in exchange. Ogi nodded, his acceptance laced with frustration. True enough. Wish they'd just told us that this would be an issue before wasting our time with that meeting, though. Completely understandable. Beyond wasting our time, the restaurant the Kyoto representative had met us in had been appalling. The sausage, an unwanted but very tangible memory of my previous life, swam uneasily in my stomach, and judging by Ogi's slight hunch, the meat pie was resisting all digestive efforts with equal vigor. While it was tempting to continue the gripe session, our time would be better spent planning for the future instead of bemoaning the past. The meeting wasn't entirely fruitless. At least we know what the 6 houses want in exchange for their support, namely, dead Britannians. I looked down at my tea, and pulled the tea bag out before it began to oversteep. This is not an unreasonable demand, especially not from where they're sitting in Kyoto, but it's a thorny issue here in Shinjuku. I didn't need to say why that was the case, both Naoto and Ogi were already nodding. Ogi probably remembered the collective punishments from years past just as well as I did, 111s for every Britannian knifed in a back alley or hit by a lucky pot shot, and Naoto had been in Shinjuku long enough to hear the stories, to see the walls with the neat lines of bullet holes. The Britannian counterinsurgency methods had been brutally effective in the years immediately following the conquest, and I had little doubt that our occupiers would return to the same bag of tricks if they learned rebellion was blooming in Shinjuku. As far as I can tell, Ogi began, speaking slowly, deliberately, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the Kyoto man only said that the Britannians had to die publicly, right? There was no requirement that we specifically had to publicly claim credit for their deaths. Yeah? I carefully replayed the representative's words in my head. Show some results, make it nice and public. No, he never said we had to claim the attacks. He seemed certain that they'd know if we were responsible. I thought about where Ogi was going with this, and thought I saw what he was implying. When I had reoriented the Kozuki cell, I had framed the decision to target the criminal gangs of Shinjuku in lieu of Britannians as a way of building a power base in Shinjuku and securing a monopoly on potential recruits. But if I was being honest, the decision had also been informed by my experiences as a child. I'd come within a hair's breadth of being part of the 100 put up against a wall once, and I remembered the helpless terror at the prospect, the sick relief when the apartment my mother and I were living in wasn't chosen, and the disgust as I'd been forced to walk past the bloody wall and the heaped bodies of the unlucky 100. I hadn't wanted to inflict that kind of suffering on others in my former situation, not without a significant and definable gain at least. I also didn't want to be hated by the people of Shinjuku for getting their families slaughtered by vengeful Britannians, the way I had despised the rebel groups of yesteryear for endangering my life. At the same time, I had always known that at some point, I wouldn't be able to put off directly striking at the Britannians any longer. People were going to die, Japanese that I wanted to preserve for the future prosperity of Area 11 included. That was unfortunately the price tag of a better life. That said, I would do everything in my power to drive the number of Japanese that had to die for the future of people down as low as I could manage. If the men from Kyoto, comfortably warm in mid-December and absolutely sure of their next meals, wanted to force my hand on the issue and move the timetable up, I couldn't stop them, but I could mitigate the risk to my people, to the people who would rebuild Area 11 into a prosperous province once again. We need to get Kyoto on our side. We need the weapons they can provide, and the money they can funnel into our accounts. Agreed? When pitching a plan, start on common ground, and get the buy-in of stakeholders. Naoto and Ogi nodded in agreement, eyes fixed on mine. Effortlessly, I quashed the first stirrings of mild anxiety. There's no need to fear, we're comrades in this endeavor. So we need to kill Britannians. But as Ogi just pointed out, we don't need to kill Britannians as a rebel group, or even as Japanese. Naoto, I turned my attention fully on the red-headed half-noble as I took a quick sip from my cup. You've already got your merry little band of assassins in training. What if we smuggled them into the Britannian concession, and simply had them waylay and knife random Britannians out late at night? If we do it right, perhaps we can dupe the authorities into thinking there's a serial murderer on the loose? Naoto looked thoughtful, but Ogi was shaking his head. I like the idea, Tanya, but the idea of just murdering random people in the street. I mean, they're Britannians, but how does that help us? Ogi had a point there. Knifing random civilians wouldn't do much to advance our goals, beyond fulfilling the minimum requirement imposed by Kyoto House. That's a fair point, Ogi. Always acknowledge useful input. We still need some Britannian blood on our hands to attract outside investment from Kyoto, though. Do you have any suggestions? Ogi leaned forward slightly. Instead of knifing random Britannian civilians, how about we target someone who actually deserves it? The purists, for example? I winced at the overconfidence on display. We just managed to take down one piddly gang, and you think we're ready for political assassinations, Ogi? Damn it, man. I tried to think of a way to let Ogi down gently, to try and find a way to phrase my opinion of his ambitious idea in a polite and inoffensive way, but before I could say anything, Naoto was already shaking his head at Ogi. Ogi, bro, look. All of the big-time purists are nobles, so they're gonna have security. We're not ready to try and kill nobles in their manners, not while getting away with it. Then it was Ogi's turn to furiously shake his head in negation. No, I don't mean the officers, I mean just the normal soldiers. I already said that I liked Danya's idea of bringing your unit into the Tokyo settlement. Naoto, I just objected to killing random civilians. Ogi turned towards me, teased pompadour bobbing slightly as he enthusiastically gesticulated. Remember what Callan said, about the divide between the purists and the rest of the military in the area? What if there's a street fight outside one of the bars where the soldiers go to drink, and a few purists happen to get stabbed by men in Britannian uniform, eh? That's going to drive that rift wide open. Ogi turned back to Naoto, eyes shining as he elaborated on his idea. Plus, if we steal the right uniforms, the men will be able to blend in as honorary Britannians. If purists suddenly start dying at the hands of honorary Britannian soldiers, that will definitely enrage the purists. Ogi, that's an excellent idea. I'd been infected by Ogi's enthusiasm, but the idea was too brilliant to resist. The Britannians already have a tradition of government by assassination, don't they? so this wouldn't even be too far out of character. But what about the honorary Britannians? I didn't want to start a pogrom against the honorary Britannians. After all, given the opportunity, I would have happily accepted the offer of second-class citizenship if it had actually been a path to a better life, or to some measure of safety. They might be collaborators, especially the honorary Britannians who had chosen to serve in the Britannian army, but they were still Japanese human resources that could potentially be won back. Plus, Callan might call me out for my hypocrisy if I suddenly announced that honorary Britannians were the enemy. How to redirect the anger away from the obvious target? We need a Britannian to lead the hit squad. I saw Naoto and Ogi's puzzled expressions, and hastily explained. The Britannians would never believe that their pet 11s decided to get up to the business of murdering purists themselves. They'd think it was some rebel movement infiltrating the honorary Britannian ranks, and start an investigation. But, if the honorary Britannians were directed by a Britannian, I let the idea hang in the air for a moment, before continuing. Plus, honorary Britannian units are usually led by Britannians anyway, and usually nobles at that. Fortunately, we've got a noble of military age and build right here at this table. I nodded at Naoto. If a group of honorary Britannians tasked with following a young drunk junior officer around for a night on the town to keep him out of trouble happened to bump into some purists, well, who knows what sparks might fly between a loudmouth and a group of arrogant idiots. Judging by the eager smile spreading over Naoto's face, the prospect of getting his hands dirty didn't trouble him in the least. After that, the rest of the plan fell in line. The best way to get uniforms, we decided, would be to steal a load of laundry from one of the honorary Britannian barracks. We would need to find out when they sent the laundry out to be washed, and how the workers who collected the laundry dressed, and Naoto brought up Callan's new role as a student reporter as a potential information-gathering source. If a young noble lady pitched the idea of a patriotic article about barracks life to the commander of an honorary Britannian unit, who likely would be desperate for recognition so he'd be promoted to command of a Britannian unit instead, getting an authorized tour of the barracks was entirely possible. We wouldn't be able to secure helmets or armor, but full battle rattle wouldn't be necessary if the unit of soldiers was just keeping an eye on an officer deep into his cups. We'd need at least one uniform from a junior officer, and ideally at least one soldier's uniform with a NCO's ranked abs to really pull off the idea of a nursemaiding detachment complete with an orderly. Once we had the uniforms secured, the infiltrating party could wear them under the overalls typically worn by 11 workers in the settlement. Securing work permits would require a few bribes, but would be eminently doable, and once in the settlement the team could hang around pretending to sweep streets or something similar until nightfall, when they could pull off the overalls and put on whatever bits of the Britannian uniforms that they hadn't been able to openly wear earlier. In terms of scoping out potential locations, the districts catering to entertaining soldiers were already well known to us, since those districts employed plenty of 11 labor for a variety of tasks. Still, Callan and I could visit one or more of those areas in the next few days to survey the lay of the land and identify bars and brothels that looked like they catered to the purists' sensibilities, hiring low-class Britannians as entertainers, for example, instead of the cheaper 11s. Perhaps we'd even be able to pitch that as another potential article for Callan's budding career as a reporter, though that might draw a bit too much suspicion to her. Ogi had winked and suggested that nobody would disturb a pair of cute girls out on a nice dinner date before Naoto smacked him, but I had to conclude that his joking idea had some merit, much to Naoto's visible irritation. Once Naoto and his group found potential targets, they would do everything they could to start a fight, ideally dragging in other soldiers in the area into the fight as well. Considering how public the divide between the main officer corps and the purist leadership under Lord Kuehl was, it was highly probable the feelings of animosity had filtered down to the lower ranks, so hopefully provoking a brawl between the Britannian factions would be fairly easy. Either way, as soon as the fighting began in earnest, the honorary Britannians backing Naoto would move in on the purists, ideally with at least one man to pin the target's limbs and another to wield the knife. As soon as the blood hit the street, Naoto's unit would break contact and disappear into the night, discarding any clothing with visible splatter marks and pulling their overalls back on. They'd find a place to lay low throughout the rest of the night, and join the ranks of weary 11s slouching back into the ghetto early the next morning. Ogi was somewhat dissatisfied with the plan, citing both the number of moving parts involved and the amount of luck we were relying on, particularly when it came to the assassins escaping pursuit and returning to Shinjuku without being detected. He also pointed out that, even if everything went off as planned, there was no guarantee that Kyoto would recognize the deaths of a handful of purist soldiers presumably at the hands of their erstwhile comrades as our work. I had to concede his last point, but I pointed out that the strike on the station market had a similar number of variables, and that every plan relied on good luck to a degree. The Kyoto representative said they'd contact us if they changed their mind, I pointed out. If that's the case, let them gather their own intelligence. Either they'll recognize our worth and they'll help us out, or they won't. Either way, the chance to turn the Britannians against each other is far too good to pass up. If they're busy fighting each other, they likely won't notice their pet gangs being rolled up in Shinjuku until it's too late. Besides, if the Britannians really do decide to take their anger out on their collaborators, that will surely undermine faith in the honorary Britannian system. Who knows, perhaps the Britannians will do our work for us, and provoke an outright mutiny among their slave soldiers. And so, the plan to dip our daggers into the Britannian back was tentatively agreed upon, and I texted Callan to arrange our next trip into the settlement. A week before Christmas, the streets of the Tokyo settlement thrummed with the frantic energy of consumerism as consumers darted their way from store to store, engaging in an orgy of purchasing. Bundled in my still new black jacket and a purple knit cap topped with a large bauble purchased on my behalf by Callan, I wondered at the existence of Christmas in this universe, and at its enthusiastic if capitalistic celebration by the Britannians. It was frankly baffling that Christianity, much less the Christmas holiday, had survived in this universe, which had departed from the history of my original world in the days of Julius Caesar, if not earlier. I had known that Britannia was officially a holy empire, and I vaguely remembered from my lessons at the Shinjuku School for 11s that the imperial family lived on St. Darwin's Street, but I hadn't thought about the implications of those bits of trivia before. I'd been more concerned with making it through the day. Though, as I walked and talked with my friend through the streets of the Tokyo settlement, I could only shake my head at the number of Santa caps I could see bobbing through the crowd. So it shouldn't be too difficult. I forced my attention away from the bizarre commonalities across the multiverse, and focused back on Callan's observations about the honorary Britannian barracks. I mean, based on what I saw, the staff at the barracks all just wear blue boiler suits, and I know that Nagata's got a whole pile of those things stashed away somewhere for plumbing work and the like. Anyway, as long as the team's out of the complex by 1300, before the normal crew shows up, nobody's going to know the difference. We're going to need to rent a truck, I noted as I squeezed through a gap between two groups of slow-moving pedestrians, Callan close behind. If the team is just hauling big sacks of laundry through the concession, it's going to draw attention. And one without the usual rental markers, Callan agreed, capturing my hand in hers and gently but firmly tugging me onto a municipal bus, swiping her card twice over the reader. The usual group just used a white panel one, I think. They were pulling around the back just as I was leaving. We're getting off in 5 stops, by the way. I nodded in response and stopped looking for a seat, grabbing one of the support poles instead as the bus lurched into motion. Beside me, Callan easily swayed with the motion, ignoring the jostling crowd around us as she looked down at the writing scrawled across her miniature notepad. She truly looked the part of the young reporter, diligently hunting the next scoop under her black and grey checked billed cap, the soft brown leather of her fitted jacket contrasting nicely with both her shoulder-length red hair and the green silk blouse she wore underneath the jacket and a tailored black vest. The black slacks and low-heeled boots completed the look, and I felt a familiar surge of envy at how easily Callan moved and balanced in heels. I had no desire to wear the silly things, of course, but I was almost certain that I'd have fallen over when the bus started moving if I'd been wearing those shoes, support pole or not. Focus, damn it. I shook my head, trying to clear my mind and get back on track. So, how was it visiting an honorary Britannian unit's base? Was it frightening? I carefully pitched my Britannian to have the right notes of curiosity, awe, and concern. Now that I'd become fully conversational in the language of the invader, I had been working with Callan to refine my delivery to fit my apparent age and appearance. A middle-class Britannian girl still 2 months shy of her 12th birthday was going to be sheltered, I decided, and amazed at the daring of her older friend to brave the den of the barbarian horde of mildly civilized 11s. Never mind that they aren't even trusted to carry weapons, I sneered internally at the thought, and never mind that they've accepted that insult with just as much resistance as they have the 1,000 that came before it either. Callan looked up from her notebook and smirked down at me, eyes dancing with amusement at my piping and worshipful tones, and I cursed her roundly from the safety of my head. It wasn't scary at all, Tanya. They're just infantry, you know, not nightmare devices or anything like that. Plus, there was a whole battalion of Britannians keeping me busy, so it's not like I was lacking for chaperones. Her smirk transmuted into a mocking smile. Just had to fawn over their uniforms and say how brave and strong they all were, and they couldn't wait to tell me anything I wanted to know. Callan flipped to another page in her notepad before handing it over, including all the locations where they and other soldiers drink, and where the purists usually make nuisances of themselves. Apparently, there's already been several fights. One of the lieutenants even spent a few nights in the brig until the major had him let out. I nodded appreciatively as I ran my eyes down the list of names and addresses of entertainment facilities patronized by soldiers, all jolted down in lilac ink in Callan's fine handwriting. I noticed about a third of the addresses had hearts beside them, and asked about that as I handed the notepad over. Brothels, Callan replied, as she flipped the pad closed and tucked it back into her purse. Ah, brothels. I'd never patronized sex workers when I'd been a man. I died before I'd ever had the first inclination to engage one of the camp followers that always seemed to lurk around the backlines, and of course in this life I'd never had any interest to go anywhere near the entertainment districts near the checkpoints into Shinjuku closest to the Britannian barracks. That said, I doubted any man, purist or otherwise, could be more vulnerable than when they were freshly spent, and in all probability drunk to boot. I'm surprised they mentioned them to you. Callan shook her head with an expression of mingled disgust and pity. One of the Britannian privates I spoke to while waiting for the captain to be available for an interview was 17, and very eager to let me know how worldly he was. I'd rarely felt so in tune with the feminine as I did in that moment as I exchanged a scornful look with Callan that just said boys, loud enough to nearly be audible. We continued to chat as the bus slowly rolled its way down the packed streets of the Britannian concession. This was the third time Callan had invited me to accompany her into the settlement since the memorable night of the first communal dinner, and each time I'd left the ghetto the streets had grown increasingly congested. By the time Callan had rescued me from the apartment after a week of enforced bed rest and light chores, the Christmas lights had been up for days and the commercial feeding frenzy had well and truly begun. I'd mulled over the possibility of smuggling one of Mr. Asahara's finest toys out of the ghetto and into one of the many crowded stores, the results of which would have no doubt fulfilled Gyojin House's stipulation, but ultimately I had decided against taking advantage of the dense throngs of shoppers. The deaths of any Britannian shoppers would undoubtedly be hung around the necks of the honorary Britannians and the 11s that worked menial jobs in the glittering shopping centers. Which brought me back to the night's itinerary. Callan had found a small bistro in the nearby entertainment district located only 2 streets away from a brothel that specialized in Britannian working girls, imported straight from the homeland for Britannia's native sons in far-off Area 11. The brothel, the Lacy Garter, was apparently owned through a holding company, to preserve respectability, by a Sir George Carew, whose son was a member of the purist branch in the area of the world I had known as Argentina. I had found it fascinating that apparently Britannian brothel culture was just as strictly stratified as the rest of Britannian society, with the institutions run in the ghetto itself reserved for honorary Britannians, Britannians engaged in manual trades, or soldiers under the rank of corporal. So Ogi probably was right about what happened to her. A crowd of drunken soldiers, having fun raising hell in the ghetto because they weren't good enough to visit a bordello in the settlement. Interestingly, Callan had found a whole guide about this very topic, which she had been kind enough to allow me to read off her phone as I pressed up against her side. I noted that there was no mention of the underground flesh pits that Ino had told me about. Even the underworld has a sordid, undesirable side in Britannia. Between the ethnicity of the prostitutes available at the Lacy Garter, and the fact that the owner was likely a purist sympathizer at the very least, Naoto and Callan believed that it was the most likely place to find obvious purists after nightfall. So, under the guise of two friends enjoying a slightly risque trip to the seedier side of town, Callan and I would use the excuse of dinner to keep an eye on the foot traffic in the area to see if the Kozuki siblings' guess had proven correct. If not, there were several other similar locations scattered around the Tokyo settlement for us to survey, which would give me the excuse to enjoy more food that I didn't have to cook myself. As we got off the bus, I noticed the general mood of the street had changed. The holiday decorations had thinned out, and the demographics of the crowd had shifted from mostly female and middle-aged to predominantly male and young. Groups of out-of-uniform enlisted soldiers and sailors, still obviously military from their body language, milled in the cold air and drank openly from cans, bottles, and flasks. Interestingly, Britannian soldiers didn't appear to be under any requirement to keep their hair short, as soldiers had been in my first life. All of the obviously military young men around me had hair at least to ear level, and a few even had shoulder-length hair. The young women drinking and laughing with the men who were not dressed in skimpy dresses and tiny bolero jackets also had long hair, with one notable blonde sporting a nearly waist-length braid. It was very strange, seeing the young soldiers of Britannia out of uniform for the first time. The soldiers manning the checkpoints of the ghetto wore helmets with faceplates and built-in gas masks. When the Britannians conducted raids and operations in the ghetto, the only men not wearing the standard full-face concealing mask were officers, who foolishly wore uniform caps even in active combat zones. Guess they think they don't need to worry about snipers while lining people up against the nearest wall. Due to their role as the ground-level face of the occupation, not to mention their masks, it was easy to forget that the men and women inside those uniforms were just as human and varied as any other group of people. After spending so much time around Westerners in my second life, many of the faces I saw around me looked eerily familiar. That man downing a can of cheap light beer in a single long draught had the same hairstyle as Vice, and the man next to him cheering his efforts could have been, well, not Grant's brother, but maybe a cousin. He's got the same nose. It was strange, seeing the features of my long-lost subordinates in the faces of my enemies. I almost wondered if I approached the now spluttering man and yelled Vice at his back if he would instinctively snap to attention, the way the man himself always had when surprised. I wonder if any of these men have beaten a whore before? The thought bubbled up from deep inside, like filthy bubbles of captured gas stirred up from the muck of a riverbed. Immediately, the vague warmness of nostalgia fled, and I remembered that murmured conversation I'd overheard between Ogi and Naoto, both well into their cups, only a week after I'd moved into their apartment. Just another 11 whore, beaten to death in the slum. Nobody's going to care, Naoto, especially since she usually worked near the barracks. Probably ran into a crowd of drunk soldiers, you know how that story goes. I didn't resist when Callan took my hand and pulled me along into the crowd, following her phone's directions to the bistro she'd picked out for tonight's dinner, and I duly kept up my side of the inane chatter that was a key part of our disguise. I carefully made sure to smile, to laugh, and to not look too long into the dark alleyways between the brick facades. I even ate my dinner, every last bite mechanically deposited into my mouth and chewed without an instant of taste. But for the rest of the evening, all I could picture were bruises upon bruises, gone yellow in the center and ringed with purple, and all I could hear was weeping, the dull sound of thrusting not quite muffled by a thin pillow. I'll never be able to find the ones who killed her, but that just means that every single one of them could have been there. And a good worker never leaves a job half finished. I laughed at Callan's joke, sipping on my coffee as she jotted down her observations on the bistro for the other part of our cover, a review of the cafe for the Ashford student newspaper, and wondered what the woman who I'd barely known would have said if she knew what her daughter was planning. I hoped she would be pleased, as I had an unsettled debt I owed her, but unless being X was feeling particularly cruel I would never really know. Fitting, since I never really knew her in life either. Several days later, Naoto and Nagato arrived at the hideout, hauling several bags of freshly stolen laundry down the 2 flights of stairs into the sub-basement. I sat idly at the table, munching on a bologna and lettuce sandwich as the two staggered over to the storage section of the hideout and dropped their heavy burdens at the foot of the shelves, secure in my excuse of not wanting to endanger my stitches to the point where I felt no need to hurl myself headfirst into any available work. The 4 recruits who had been blazing away at paper targets with Britannian Army-issue coilgun pistols, however, weren't so lucky. "Cease fire. Safe your weapons. Are you trying to kill me, you idiots?" Tamaki's bellow effortlessly overwhelmed the sounds of electromagnetically accelerated firearms, and within seconds all 4 pistols were safety and on the ranger's table in a neat row. "You lot are getting sloppy. Take a 5-minute break from shooting, and help Naoto haul that fucking garbage inside. Go, go, go." It had been a surprise, watching Tamaki in action as a trainer. Despite the way he was swaggering around and barking at them, the recruits all grinned back at Tamaki as he bossed them around, and Hojo even gave him a mocking salute. I would have stepped in to discourage the disrespectful response, but all 4 immediately hustled over to Naoto and Nagata, helping them move the bags out of the way and following the pair back upstairs to haul down the next load. I'd initially encouraged Ogi, and through him Naoto, to put Tamaki in charge of training at least partially to give Tamaki some experience with responsibility and with leadership, but I'd harbored admittedly mixed expectations of his performance. I'd hoped he'd be able to teach them the basics of obedience, of whatever physical training program he did to get so lean and muscular, and the basics of firearm use and maintenance, but I hadn't expected him to handle the first batch of recruits entrusted to him half as well as he had. Frankly, it wasn't the way I would have trained them, and it was certainly a far cry from either the methods or the philosophy I had used when training my beautiful 203rd, but the situation was far different as well. It had been made clear to me by events over the last 8 months that an irregular group like our own ran not on obedience to a hierarchy, but influence from personal bonds and from the reputation garnered by one's actions and capabilities. Tamaki was well on his way to developing both with his trainees. The former gangsters obviously had a familiarity with violence, but that was almost more of a hindrance than anything else, from what Tamaki told me. They had never been trained to fight, picking up everything as they went, and apparently they were full of bad habits. One of the men hadn't taken kindly to Tamaki saying as much during the first days of their training, and it hadn't been until Tamaki had slammed him to the ground and pinned him 3 times in a best 3 of 5 set of freeform brawls that he'd finally started listening. The ex-gangsters were clearly accustomed to taking orders from people they perceived as strong, which was a good thing both for their training and for the process of weaning Hojo off the painkiller addiction he'd confessed at the Rising Sun building. Despite the man's nausea, anxiety, and the pain radiating from his scarred limb, Hojo was still holding strong and listening to Tamaki's commands, with Naoto's occasional support. Tamaki had proven remarkably sympathetic, according to Naoto, and the 2 of them apparently were already friends despite Tamaki's status as Hojo's teacher and supervisor. Reputation and personal influence, both artless in their sincerity. Tamaki was indeed proving his worth as a training officer. Unfortunately, in recovery or not, Hojo would not be accompanying Tamaki and Naoto into Tokyo. He and his fellow ex-gangster recruit, Hina, the sole female of the cohort, wouldn't fit the role of honorary Britannian soldiers, since as far as Callan had discovered in her information gathering the only units of honorary Britannian soldiers in the area were entirely male. That said, the other 2 male recruits were apparently coming along splendidly. According to Tamaki's reports, they would be more than capable of playing the silent honorary Britannian muscle, following a slacking officer around and keeping the muggers away from his wallet, up until it came time to play the part of the Sicarii. As the recruits came back down the stairs with more bulging canvas sacks slung over their shoulders, I decided to be mildly productive and diverted 2 of the laundry bags over to my table, bolting down the last of my sandwich as Hojo staggered over, sweating from the exertion of rushing up and down stairs with the load and presumably, also from his ongoing withdrawal pains. I thanked him around a mouthful of lunch meat, earning a wan smile that was half a painful grimace, before he staggered off to rejoin his cohort over at the range. For a criminal, he has a commendable work ethic. Doing my best to ignore the stench of sweat and filth, I dumped the first sack onto the table, and started going through the heap of clothing. Naoto soon joined me, and we sifted through the heap of unwashed fatigues, finally separating out 3 complete sets of fatigues, including the real prize, a uniform shirt and jacket with a first sergeant's rank tabs. We set those aside, along with 3 undershirts, to be washed and dried for the upcoming mission. Finding an officer's uniform took a surprisingly short time, since unlike the enlisted and NCOs whose individual laundry sacks were crammed into larger formation-level bags, the officer's laundry was bagged separately. The challenging part was finding a uniform that fit Naoto's tall frame and broad shoulders, since it seemed like the 3 lieutenants were all shorter than he was. Ultimately, Naoto ended up with a captain's uniform with sewn-on lieutenant tabs. In the unlikely event that anybody noticed, hopefully they'd chalk the minor discrepancy up to a recent demotion, which might help to explain why he was drunkenly wandering around and picking fights. Phew. Glad that's over. Naoto stood up from the couch and stretched, before knuckling his back, sighing with satisfaction at something popped under the kneading motion. Never thought I'd end up pouring through other men's dirty laundry for the cause, or at least, not this literally. Eh? He smiled down at me, moving his eyebrows up and down like a stereotypical dirty old man. I gave his weak attempt at humor the pity laugh obligated by the mores of society, and the fool dramatically groaned his misery at the response, palming his face and sinking back to the couch. Misery. Oh misery. I have given so much, sacrificed so much for Japan, and yet I'm still mocked by the youth. What will become of us old folk, subject to the whims of evil children? Cry the beloved country, these things are not yet at an end, I replied in Britannian, quoting a book I was certain had never been written in this universe, and certainly would not have been allowed to see the light of day if it were. After all, you've still got to wash your laundry so you don't drive the purists with your stench before you can put a knife between their ribs. Also, you should probably wash all the other uniforms too, we might need them later. I considered volunteering to take a few of the recruits and get started on the task, but then I remembered Naoto's pathetic joke and reconsidered. I would, of course, help you out, oh glorious leader, but my wound sadly leaves me incapable of scrubbing clothes enough to get the stench of traitors out, so I guess it's up to you. Naoto let out a second, more elaborate, groan of anguish and collapsed back onto the couch. I patted his knee with feigned sympathy and got to my feet, scooping up the backpack Callan had given me months back and swinging it onto my back as I rose. By the way, I began, dropping the mockingly obsequious tone, tomorrow's going to be Christmas Eve, and 2 weeks to the day from the meeting with Kyoto House. I'm sure they're impatiently waiting to see what we'll do to earn their good graces and support, and I'm also sure that there will be plenty of drunken soldiers wandering around. I turned back to Naoto, who'd straightened up on the couch, and smiled at him. Why don't you and your boys join the festivities, and go get the old men in Kyoto a nice Christmas present tomorrow night? Naoto paused for a moment, turning the idea over in his head, and nodded. I'll tell Callan to get 4 work passes arranged for tomorrow. He stood up, and pulled out his phone, following me to the door of the hideout. Behind us Tamaki yelled something indistinct, and the sounds of coil guns began to echo through the subterranean concrete box once more. There'll definitely be lots of need for street cleaners tomorrow, so I expect there will be more passes issued to handle all the holiday bullshit than normal. We've already got the overalls and such for each man, so once the uniforms are clean we'll be ready. I nodded my satisfaction and almost turned to go when I saw a somewhat shifty expression cross the other half Britannian's face. Out with it. Naoto coughed, and started to blush, visibly embarrassed. I can't so. I'm going to need some, help to get the rank tabs onto the uniform. Being significantly taller than my 4¼ feet, Naoto of course always looked down at me in the literal sense, but in that moment he somehow seemed shorter than I was. It's probably the puppy dog eyes. Could you help me get them on please, Tanya? I don't want to ask Callan. The last time I got her to sew a patch onto my jeans, she said she'd start charging if I ever asked again. I felt the desire to leave him to whatever market price Callan could extort from his lazy body. Why the hell can't he just learn to sew himself? Unfortunately, as someone else had discovered in a different life, my tolerance to the sad puppy look was intolerably low. I felt an irritated groan rise in my throat, and stifled it only with determined effort. Why do I keep agreeing to help people? I'm supposed to be a ruthless guerrilla, a rebel fighting a shadow war, damn it. Wash the fucking uniform first. I'm not going to let my nostrils be polluted with the stink of Britannia any longer. As Naoto boomed out an overly enthusiastic thank you, I turned on my heel and stormed off, jealous that the red-headed louse would soon have the opportunity to blow off some steam in the Britannian concession, complete with a work-related excuse to stagger around the entertainment areas of town feigning public intoxication and the opportunity to engage in some highly unprofessional conduct. Meanwhile, I'm still benched at home thanks to my already all but healed flesh wound, left to do the domestic work and helping out with the Rising Sun's paperwork while my leader gets to knife whoremongering purists. I suddenly realized what I had been thinking and came to a stop in the street outside the ruined tenement that cloaked the entrance to the hideout, replaying the last few points of my internal monologue. I'm upset that I have to stay back and do the rear echelon work, instead of going out and picking fights with Britannians. That couldn't be right. I'd always wanted rear echelon work, and suddenly I'd had a perfect reason to stay safely away from combat dumped in my lap. My work was well respected, and everybody acknowledged my planning and support roles as valuable and necessary. I had a salary of food, funds and shelter, an outrageous degree of luxury in the slums, and I had a meaningful job with pleasant co-workers and the respect of my peers. By all logic, I had it made. So why am I so jealous of Naoto and the rest of his team? I paused, and then shook my head. It was just a foolish impulse, that's all. But the memory of laughing Britannians, drunk on cheap beer and the invincibility of youth, scantily clad women with mostly Japanese features with a few half-breeds thrown in fawning over them in the street, trying not to shiver in the near midwinter cold. I wonder if any of these men have beaten a whore before? Something still burned in me, as I imagined the bacchanalia of the entertainment district turning to horror as the sting of war intruded on the Britannian sector for a night, the way it always hung over Shinjuku like a choking shroud. I hoped lots of Britannians ended up blamed for the fight and the deaths sure to come, quixotic as the hope might be. It would be nice if the Britannians ended up beating each other to death in the streets for once, instead of some unlucky 11th sister or daughter, wife or mother. Forcing the fantasy away and the emotional lump in my throat back down, I ignored the feverish heat radiating from my belly and started walking again. I might not be on call to fight tomorrow night, but I could eat plenty and get lots of sleep before Naoto left for the settlement. If any sign that something had gone wrong came through, I'd be ready to go with every bit of my pitiful magic available to bail them out. And hopefully leave a few empty places at the old Christmas dinner table myself. The liberated fatigue pants had not, to Tamaki's mild annoyance, come with a belt, and hung loose around his hips as a result. Since Naoto and Nagata had just robbed the contents of the laundry hampers, it wasn't surprising that things like belts and boots were missing, but scrounging around at the last minute to secure replacements had been kinda irritating. Fortunately, Tamaki had been able to pass it off to his little group of rookies as a training exercise improving their scrounging and improvisation skills. Fortunately, the ex-gangsters had retained every bit of their ability to requisition goods as necessary. The blackened work boots looked pretty much like combat boots, at least from a distance, and the clearly non-regulation buckle on his belt would be hidden under first the overalls, and then the uniform's jacket. Tamaki snapped the buckle of said belt closed with a satisfying click and straightened up, taking a long look down at himself, making sure the pants hung straight and no bulge was evident on his left thigh where the Britannian-issue combat knife was strapped. Fortunately, the grey and black uniform trousers betrayed no obvious sign of the hidden knife, and any slight crease in the fabric would be hidden by his second layer. Satisfied with the first level of his disguise, Tamaki buttoned up his threadbare cotton work shirt and stepped into the pooled legs of his overalls, pulling the stinking, stained garment up over the uniform trousers and fastening the clips of the shoulder straps. Finally, Tamaki pulled an equally worn and patched black winter coat over his shoulders to complete the appearance of a transitory 11 worker, the outer layer heavy and warm thanks to the hidden contents of the lining. The interior lining of the coat had been carefully cut out, the uniform jacket sewn in with loose, fragile stitching as an intermediate layer along with the folded uniform cap, and the original lining sewn back into place. Unfortunately, once the active stage of the plan was done, the lining-less jackets would be more or less useless as warm layers during the extraction process, but Tamaki supposed that a few hours of cold was preferable to detection and detainment at the checkpoint back into Shinjuku. Satisfied with his own disguise, Tamaki turned and looked over at Naoto, who was lounging against a wall and fiddling with an unlit quarter hand roll. The half-noble hadn't shaved in the last several days, giving him a look of general dishevelment, and his distinctive red hair had been dyed blonde and crammed away under a cap. In his own threadbare overalls and jacket, coupled with the total lack of any poise, no trace of Kozuki Naoto, the rising terror of Shinjuku, could be seen. All Tamaki saw was an exhausted worker, hungry for the meager relief provided by the low nicotine content of the ghetto smoke in his trembling fingers. Fuck, Naoto's going method with his acting. At the sound of a muttered curse, Tamaki looked over at the two members of his unit he'd be leading into the Tokyo settlement with Naoto. Jin, a rangy man in his mid-20s, had just finished lacing up his boot and was fiddling with the pants leg, carefully blousing the bottom into the top of his boot in the way that some honorary Britannians did. following the example of the Britannians instead of the exact requirements of their manual. Inuyama already had his boots on and was muttering curses as he violently shoved a hand down his pants, trying to shift the location of the hidden knife. Inuyama was so involved in his work, half his right forearm in his uniform trousers, that he didn't even notice Tamaki approaching. "Hey now. We're going into the field, Inuyama. Save that kind of thing till we get back." Tamaki laughed as he dropped his arm across his subordinate's shoulder, the other man leaping up and nearly biting his tongue as he tried to turn on his left heel, still with his arm down his pants. "The hell are ya trying to do anyway?" As soon as Inuyama realized who'd accosted him, he stopped trying to simultaneously curse, turn, and stab Tamaki, and instead just chuckled with an unmistakable edge of smugness. "No need to do that now or after the mission, yeah damned punk." Inuyama looked up at Tamaki, a shit-eating grin on his face. "Hina's been taking real good care of me. Turns out your suggestion about that bottle of single malt was right on the money." Tamaki let out a whoop of excitement. "Dude. Congrats, man. So that's where you two disappeared to last night. Fuck yeah." He considered going for a high five, but reconsidered when he realized that Inuyama was still nearly elbow-deep in his own trousers, settling for a congratulatory pat on the back instead. "I hope that old bastard Jiru didn't charge ya too much for the bottle." Inuyama winced slightly, but smiled again. "It was totally worth it, man. Even if it is kinda hard to share a sleeping bag." Tamaki smiled back at his subordinate, internally congratulating himself on his work so far. After Tanya, Ogi, and Naoto had suddenly dropped responsibility for the recruits on his lap several weeks ago, Tamaki had decided to prioritize building loyalty in his new recruits right behind building obedience. Fortunately, between Tanya's victory over the gang, surprising only to the new recruits, as Tamaki's shoulder was still sore on cold nights from the one time he'd crossed the little goblin, and the utterly terrifying display of ruthlessness courtesy of Naoto, the whole issue of obedience had been more or less settled before it had even come up. Sure, Tamaki had been forced to prove his ability to lead by flooring Inuyama a couple of times back at the beginning, but that wasn't a big deal or anything. Plus, the man was a great drinking buddy and sparring partner, so Tamaki was fine with a little bit of lip. So, since he didn't really need to worry much about disobedience, Tamaki had focused on building up loyalty to both himself and to the organization in his new trainees. Tamaki knew he wasn't exactly brilliant, but he wasn't stupid either, and he'd been keeping a close eye on Tanya after she'd effortlessly beaten him into the ground. He'd realized that the girl he'd once been foolish enough to call a Brit almost made it a point to not rule by fear or strength. Instead, she'd made an effort to reach out to every member of the cell and get to know them, and to give them what they wanted. Ino had been stressed from carrying all the boring work on her shoulders, and had been feeling a bit isolated. Being the only woman in the cell, Callan didn't count, and Tanya had given her a female friend and an assistant who understood all that math crap. Nagata loved his wife and kid deeply, that much was obvious from just a casual conversation with the man. Tamaki had known him for almost 2 years now, and knew he was torn between the fear of dying and not knowing his kid, and having his kid grow up in a slum. Tanya had given him a job that didn't involve any front-line combat, and had also made sure he had plenty of food to pay for a neighborhood granny to look after the kid. Tamaki didn't like self-reflection or any of that crap, but after he'd realized what Tanya was doing, he started to wonder what she was giving to him to get his loyalty. He knew he respected the little squirt. She was a monster in hand-to-hand, an incredible shot, and absolutely cold as ice when it came time to kill, but he was surprised to find that he liked her too. For all her nagging, she was pretty good company, after you got over the initial reaction of "oh shit, a fucking Brit's in our base," and all that. She had a subtle sense of humor, where jokes she told flew past his head until a second later when they slammed home. She was happy to chat with him about guns or nightmares and other crap, and she was a hard worker. "She doesn't treat me like an idiot either." That was important. Even Ogi and Naoto looked at him sometimes like he was some kind of clown, but Tanya never did. She often looked irritated or disappointed, but she never looked down at him. Looking back on it, Tamaki thought it was that respect, more than anything else, that has earned her his loyalty. Tamaki was sick of thinking by the time he'd gotten through all that, and so he'd rounded up all of his little crew for a trip to a private slice of heaven. A year or two ago, his buddy Chizao, who had welding equipment, and 2 or 3 other guys plus Tamaki had gotten together to make their own gym in a mostly abandoned basement. The homemade weights were crappy, just a variety of pipes with amounts of sand inside and caps welded over their ends, but they did the job, as did the creaky wooden bench Gendo, who knew a bit of carpentry, had nailed together and glued a cushion onto. This was his secret home away from home, where he came to maintain his toned physique, where he kept himself as shredded as any honest Japanese guy could on the thin food and low protein levels available in Shinjuku. The new recruits had taken the gesture for what it was, an expression of trust, and an offer for group communion. People join up to gangs for more than just a fully belly and protection, they join up for brotherhood, for friends. Tamaki wondered if Tanya knew how good her idea to put him in charge of the former gangsters had been. After all, he'd come within a hair's breadth of joining up with the gangs, before Naoto and Ogi had returned to his life and pulled him into their anti-Britannian action group. The only reason he'd been free to join up with them was he could feel his father's ghost smack him over the head whenever he thought of joining up, but those slaps had been weakening in the months leading up to Ogi's sudden arrival. "Yeah, I know a thing or two about the kind of folks who join gangs, all right." After he brought them to the basement gym and set them free on the weights, Tamaki had taken Hojo, Hina, Inuyama, and Jin aside one by one, talking with them and getting to know his new comrades. Hojo's hook had been pretty easy to figure out, since he'd already owned up to the whole pain pill addiction thing, but Tamaki had taken the time to ask about more than just "what's your tea level like?" and had found himself rewarded with a pent-up river of unspoken thoughts and smothered ambitions, which he frankly had no idea how to handle. Taking a page from Tanya's book, he'd nodded seriously, maintained eye contact, and thanked Hojo for his openness once the torrent of words had slowed to a relative trickle. When Tamaki handed over the pills set aside by Naoto to help wean Hojo off his dependency, he made sure to be as respectful as possible. When the shakes and nausea set in, he made a point to be on hand to chat with Hojo, to try and take his mind off things. Jin, apparently, was both a smoker and a big music guy, and so Tamaki had made sure that he always had a pack or two of Britannian cigarettes with real tobacco around on the weekends to reward the man for his hard work, plus tips about which barterers had caches of CDs available in the trade goods. Inuyama was practically a belly on legs, with a particular love for meat, a luxury good in Shinjuku. Tamaki had put in a special request with Ino for an extra 2 rations of meat for the man, and soon Nagata had arrived with a whole box of cheap jerky in a variety of flavors. Apparently, whatever flavors Inuyama hadn't liked he'd turned around into trade goods to get the smuggled bottle to buy his lady's affections. Hina's requests, once Tamaki had taken her aside, had been somewhat heartbreaking in their simplicity, yet eminently practical. Tampons, sanitary pads, a safety razor, aspirin, and if possible, birth control pills had been all she'd initially asked for. Tamaki, remembering how sunken the four's cheeks had been when they'd slunk into the Rising Sun's meeting hall, didn't rip her for asking for so little. Instead, he simply told her that all but the last request were freely available from the Rising Sun's stocks, thanks to Tanya and Ino, and that the last would be available as soon as a cheap and reliable supplier could be found. Hina hadn't responded to that information at the time beyond a simple "I see," but after verifying that Tamaki had told the truth, and after drawing a ration of female hygiene and relief products from Ino, Hina had returned, thanked him, and put in a request for a warm coat, fresh vegetables, and for the Rising Sun to deliver a takeout box for a family of 4 to the apartment of a single mother and her 3 children slightly north of their usual area of operations. Ino had assured him that none of the requests had been hard to meet, and soon green bell peppers and unripened tomatoes joined the inventory of regular shipments into Shinjuku. Of course, all of the peppers and cigarettes in the world paled in comparison to the experience of risking your lives side by side, and coming out laughing and smiling on the other side. As Naoto had begun his shadowy campaign of violence against the gangs, Tamaki had begged his boss for the chance to bring his trainees along for their first operation as part of the organization. After Tamaki agreed to take full responsibility for their actions, Naoto had gladly welcomed them into his systematic destruction of the gang that had tried to shake down the Rising Sun. Hojo, once a member of the Kokirikai and thus privy to the locations of all the old safe houses being used by the Splinter Gang, had been particularly valuable, but all 4 had enthusiastically thrown themselves into the slaughter of their former comrades. Starting from quiet knifings of unwary or isolated gangsters, the 4 had been led by Tamaki through a gauntlet of missions handed down from the leading trio, culminating in the glorious night Tamaki had fired a shoulder-mounted missile into a warehouse-turned-meth lab. The incredible explosion and the chemically fueled flames still burnt in his mind when he thought about the nightmare in the station Tanya had blown up aside. Tamaki didn't know if he'd ever seen anything quite as beautiful as the roaring blaze he'd caused. It had been an intense 3 weeks of near-constant activity, training with his new detachment as they waited for the next mission, occasionally helping out Ino and Tanya at the Rising Sun to help keep the recruits, and Tamaki, if he was being honest, anchored with the cause, with why they were fighting. The only major sticking point in the time had been after the liberation of the gang's slave brothels a week prior. That particular job had been carried out by Naoto personally, with Suichiro and Chihiro's help, and Tamaki hadn't envied them the job. When Naoto had returned, eyes empty and bleak, followed by a line of women wrapped in bloody blankets shepherded by a grinning Chihiro, Tamaki already knew celebrating wasn't going to be in the cards. He didn't know what the women Naoto had brought back from the raid had endured, and frankly he didn't want to know either, but he was fairly sure that none of them would welcome the offer of a beer. Tamaki had expected weeping, he'd expected uncomfortably degrees of decidedly unmanly emotion, and he'd expected to be asked to take the male contingent of his unit elsewhere to sleep for the night. He hadn't expected one of the women to suddenly scream "You," pull a knife, and lunge at Jin, who had backpedaled away from his knife-wielding assailant while fumbling for the pistol belted to his waist. Tamaki had managed to move fast enough to grab Jin's arm before he actually got a shot off, while Chihiro had wrestled the knife away from the screaming woman who had persisted in her attempts to claw out Jin's eyes, nearly overwhelming the younger and fitter Chihiro. Fortunately, Ogi had been only steps behind Naoto's group, and between Naoto's demands that everybody stop immediately and Ogi's calming, conciliatory words, the worst was averted. Tamaki had been sorely tempted to beat the shit out of all 3 of his male subordinates when he'd learned that they all knew what had been happening in those brothels, but the fact that none of them had been directly involved with that side of their gang's operations had stayed his hand. They had, however, been forced through the most rigorous 3-day training program Tamaki could whip up, as had Hina, since Tamaki didn't want to play favorites and she'd known damn well what was happening too and hadn't bothered to do anything about it. That was all in the past now, though. Tamaki was confident in the abilities of his trainees, and confident in their attachment to the organization and the camaraderie it represented, if not the nebulous goals Tanya and Naoto periodically alluded to. Which puts them in the same boat with me, I guess. Tamaki thumped Inuyama one last time on the shoulders in celebration, before disentangling himself from the taller man and turning to Naoto. The leader of the cell had put away his cigarette and had been watching the back and forth between Tamaki and his men with an almost cold expression of disinterested weariness, but he perked up when Tamaki looked back his way. Wonder how well he's sleeping these days? Tamaki had helped Naoto with some of his more sticky jobs, and was perfectly content to leave all that fucked up shit to Naoto, if only so he didn't have to drink himself to sleep every night. Better yet, leave that crap up to Chihiro, that crazy bitch. Out loud, Tamaki said, "We're ready to rock and roll, boss." He didn't have to fake the confidence, this was a Tanya plan, so it was going to be solid, and he was confident in the men going into Brittown with him. They're never gonna know what hit 'em. Say the word, and we can head to the checkpoint. Naoto lifted a single skeptical eyebrow, casting a look over Jin, who was shrugging into his coat, and Inuyama, who was screwing around with his goddamned knife again. If you say so. Let's get gone. By the time Tamaki and the rest of the small team of infiltrators got to the checkpoint and to the Britannian concession, work passes and lunchboxes in hand, it was almost 6 at night and the sun had vanished beyond the horizon 2 hours earlier. The group joined the long queue of shivering 11 workers waiting for their chance to pick up night shift work in the Tokyo settlement. A nearly palpable miasma of depressed resignation thickened the air as the line slowly shuffled forwards. The guards appeared equally unhappy, from what Tamaki could make out through the darkness and the milling crowd. The few inspections they bothered with were almost perfunctory, and while they of course collected the usual administration fees, none of the Britannians on duty appeared to have the energy to aggressively shake down any of the hapless 11s. Wonder who they pissed off to get assigned to stand out in the cold on Christmas Eve? Despite the complete lack of enthusiasm exhibited by the guards, Tamaki knew that the checkpoint represented the first major point of failure in the operation. If those bastards think we've got some extra cash somewhere, or just wanna screw with us. Best case scenario, they'd just be turned back and not allowed to enter the concession, aborting the mission. Worst case, the guards would realize they were trying to smuggle weapons into the settlement, and then they'd be arrested, interrogated, and shot. Wish I'd taken the time to make sure Inuyama could walk straight with the knife. Damn it. Tamaki exhaled, and forced himself to calm down. It was too late to do anything now, and getting all agitated would mark him out as suspicious. Deliberately, Tamaki let his shoulders slump and buried his hands in his pockets, and tried to think about anything but the night's work ahead. A tense half an hour later, Tamaki dutifully handed over his work pass for stamping, a few crumpled bills pressed against the bottom just like always. The guard, faceless as always behind the rebreather and the mirrored visor of his helmet, barely glanced at either his face or his pass, apathetically thumping the barely inked stamp down on the cardstock of the pass. With a muttered thanks, Tamaki reclaimed the pass and shuffled his way into the Britannian concession, joining Naoto on a street corner a block away. Stamping their booted feet to keep the cold out, the two waited in silence as first Jin, and then Inuyama made their way through the checkpoint. To Tamaki's relief, Inuyama's slightly stiff gait apparently hadn't stood out as remarkable in a crowd of cold, malnourished laborers. Plus, the guards were probably wishing they were coming with us to the entertainment zone instead of hanging around the ghetto. Ha! Tamaki smiled as Inuyama trudged his way over, and considered sharing his insight with Naoto. A look over at his boss's blank expression dissuaded him. Naoto's got his game face on, probably not in the mood for joshing around. He's gotten pretty serious lately, ever since he and Chihiro had started hacking people apart. As soon as Inuyama joined them on the corner, Naoto turned and started walking, heading southeast along with most of the other 11 men allowed into the concession, Tamaki close on his heels and the other 2 men tagging along behind. The loose string of workers were headed for what had once been the Ginza district, though the area had been redeveloped and filled with the same ugly Britannian architecture as the rest of the Tokyo settlement. The old Ginza had retained its mercantile character. At this fever pitch of the holiday season, it was a safe bet that the many shops and restaurants would need extra hands to deal with the horde of last-minute shoppers, not in the front of house, of course, not for the 11s, but in the stockrooms and the kitchens where their non-Britannian features wouldn't offend any paying customer. The small knot of Shinjuku fighters blended into the shambling crowd, hunkering down into their thin jackets as best they could against the heat-leaching wind, just like every other man present. The women, by and large, had taken a different turn after passing through the checkpoint, but it was far too early in the night to be seen anywhere near that side of town. As Tamaki trudged down the street, he reflected on how strangely nostalgic it was to return to this particular corner of the Britannian concession. During the first months of the cell's existence, their piddling missions had more often than not been carried out in this general area. In fact, the warehouse where he'd offed that fat idiot of a security guard was only about half a kilometer away from his current location. First time I'd killed. Fucker shouldn't have surprised me like that. What kinda idiot decides to risk their life for someone else's inventory, huh? The area south of the old Shuo ward and west of the Ginza was a mixed-use area, where the warehouses holding stock for the glitzy shopping districts and refined outlets rubbed shoulders with the homes of middle-class Britannians and the scattered estates of minor nobility, with small strip malls and convenient grocery stores dotted throughout. The center of the area was the ruined husk of the Keisumagaseki station, completely collapsed after the Britannian aerial bombardment that had left the nearby Tokyo Metropolitan Police headquarters a gutted shell. During the redevelopment of the area, the remnants of the old police headquarters had been unceremoniously shoveled into the open moor where the station's roof and the nearby tunnels had caved in, thereby avoiding the cost of hauling away the rubble or filling the gaping hole with gravel. Tamaki vaguely remembered that there had been a resistance cell operating out of the area, living in the old tunnels and emerging by night to loot whatever they could and raise hell. That's where Naoto got that sack of hand grenades, right? Now that he thought about it, Tamaki realized he hadn't heard any mention of the Keisumagaseki resistance cell for months. Probably means they're okay. If the Brits had caught a legit group of rebels, they'd have been trumped in about it all day every day. Hope they're still fighting the good fight somewhere. Of course, it was entirely possible that the tunnel they had layered up in had just collapsed from the lack of maintenance and entombed the whole lot in concrete and steel. Fuck, I hope not. That's a horrible way to go. 40 minutes and a 2-mile walk later, Tamaki and his merry band found themselves in the desolate no-man's land around the ruined Tokyo Tower. The colossal heap of twisted girders and gutted hopes was red with rust and creaked with each errant gust, moaning like a man dying from a gut wound. To Tamaki, Tokyo born and bred, the tower was an almost tangible symbol of all that had happened to the city of his birth and her people. Broken, pillaged, and left in squalor, the broken tower screamed its agony to all that would hear. The fact that the Brits haven't paved it over like they did the Imperial Palace has got to be intentional. Just another way of rubbing everything in our faces. The bastards. It was fitting that the tower, and the boarded-up station below it, would shelter her sons before they set out on their Tanya-appointed task, and afterwards as they hid from vengeful eyes. Even by the usual standards of the desolate grave of Tokyo's pride, the place was deserted. Far away, a maglev train traversed the elevated rail, but to Tamaki the faint whistling of the wind suddenly took on a sepulchral air. He shivered, the chill unrelated to the midwinter night. The aching heart of Tokyo was empty, without even the desperate bustle of Shinjuku to provide traces of life and light. This was a dead city, a place abandoned by the living, and yet Tamaki was certain that under every pile of shattered cement and broken brick were human bones. The four men, by unspoken consensus, picked up their pace, lightly jogging through the necropolis, looking for the faded signs directing long-gone foot traffic to the nearest subway station. A few minutes of searching later, and the group stood before the rotted plywood sheets screwed into place over an entrance to Kamiyacho Station. Tamaki gestured at Inuyama, who nodded and drew his knife and started gradually easing the first screw free of the pulpy wood. Jin followed suit, working on the screw on the opposite side of the board, and a minute later Tamaki and Naoto filed into the exposed entrance to the tunnel, damp air rushing up into their faces until Inuyama carefully pulled the board over the hole after them, propping it back into its former position. Once the board was back in place, sheltering the group from any spectacularly out-of-place Britannian who happened to be spending Christmas Eve in the most wretched part of Tokyo outside of the ghetto, Tamaki let himself relax a bit. Stretching and yawning, he unclipped the miniature flashlight from the inside of his arm and clicked it on, letting the light trace over the textured yellow rubber strips at the edge of the steps leading downwards to a plug of rubble and soil blocking access to the station itself, or the tunnels even further down below the surface. A horrible way to go. Well, Naoto broke the silence as all four stared at the collapse, the still sharp edges of the concrete shards indicating that the stairway had been passable until recently. It's not as luxurious as I'd hoped, but I guess this is where we're going to be changing, gentlemen. Get changed, and we'll start reviewing. Soon, all four men were industriously tearing the stitches out of their coats, freeing the smuggled contraband. Tamaki vaguely regretted tearing out the stitches that he himself had carefully made the night before, but that regret wasn't what caused his shoulders to shake in the near dark of the collapsed staircase. No, it was all he could do to keep up his professional, on-the-job facade, and suppress a laugh of mingled nervous anxiety and hilarity at the memory of Naoto prostrate on all fours, begging an 11-year-old to help him after he'd somehow managed to sew the sleeves of his coat together. Fucking rich boys probably always had maids for that kinda work. Tamaki knew the internal mockery wasn't true in the slightest, but that didn't matter in the face of comedy, especially when he wasn't stupid enough or petty enough to share the joke with men who hadn't known Naoto for years. Besides, it's all in the name of keeping my morale up. Fuck, did the roof just creak? I really hope not. Soon, Tamaki found himself checking over Inuyama and Jin, making sure their honorary Britannian uniforms were as straight and crisp as possible, before Jin returned the favor. The sergeant's chevrons sewn onto his shoulder and chest were the only difference between his uniform and theirs, and Tamaki had carefully slicked his sometimes uncontrollable hair down before leaving Shinjuku that evening so the side cap would sit squarely on his head. Jin and Inuyama's hair was still quite a bit on the short side for Britannian soldiers, but hopefully their carefully placed caps would draw attention away from that minor detail. After getting the nod from Jin, Tamaki turned to Naoto and carefully ran his penlight over his boss, and unsurprisingly found him in perfect order, looking alarmingly comfortable and at ease in the uniform of a Britannian officer. The illusion of Britannian perfection was somewhat weakened by the loose tie and open collar of his shirt, and further undermined by the wink Naoto shot his way. Tamaki couldn't help but smile at the exaggerated look of aristocratic disdain on his friend's face, before the pseudo-professional mask cracked entirely and the boyish smile so rare in past weeks flashed across Naoto's face. It's finally the time, eh, Tamaki? We're finally doing it. We're finally going after some Brit bastards ourselves, just like you always wanted. The exuberant tone and the guileless blue eyes were a sharp contrast to the violence to come, but Tamaki couldn't help the answering grin creeping across his face. "It's good to see the old Naoto back. Gloomy Naoto's way too boring." "Fuck yeah, bro. We're gonna show 'em we mean business. Wanna bet we each bag a purist son of a bitch before the night's over?" Tamaki knew that he should be maintaining professional discipline in front of his men, but, fuck it. They'd be squatting in this stinking wet tunnel for an hour and a half practicing basic Britannian commands and waiting for the bastards enjoying themselves in the whorehouses to get nice and drunk. At least he could get a laugh or two before he subjected himself to language lessons. Naoto laughed and patted Tamaki on the shoulder. "You've got to raise your game, Tamaki. We just need to get the ball rolling, and the purists will do way more damage to their own side than we would if we just spent the whole night shanking people." Tamaki rolled his eyes in fond exasperation, and adopted a wheedling tone. "But where's the fun in that? I want to show those Brit bastards this Japanese boy's got guts, one-on-one, man-on-man." Naoto raised a skeptical eyebrow, nearly invisible in the dark of the tunnel. "The way you showed Tanya? She did nearly splatter your guts across the hideout. I suppose that would have proved the point once and for all." This time, Tamaki didn't have to feign a whine. "Ah, come on. That was an honest mistake. And that girl's terrifying. I bet she'd eat a nightmare by herself, if her mouth was just a bit wider." "Wait, what?" Inuyama burst into the conversation. A step behind him, Jin looked on at the conversation with interest. "You fought Tanya, bro? And you're still alive? How the fuck did that happen?" With rising horror, Tamaki turned towards the two wolves in the shape of men that lurked beyond the small circle of light, dreading the ribbing he was about to receive. He'd completely forgotten that they hadn't been there back in the day to watch him get totally schooled by a scrawny kid. Worse still, judging by the shit-eating grin on Naoto's face, he was completely willing to tell the story in full if Tamaki stepped away from the challenge. Biting the bullet, Tamaki sighed and beckoned the two over as he sat down, placing the work overall between his behind and the damp concrete step, desperately trying to find some way to spin the story so he didn't come off as quite such an idiot. "If you're gonna collapse, Roof, now would be a good time." Okay, so, no shit, there I was. An hour and a half of careful coaching by Naoto later, and Tamaki felt more or less confident in his ability to dutifully nod and say yes sir with only the faintest trace of a Japanese accent. Together with Jin and Inuyama, he had also gone over the command phrases for when it was time to run. It was of vital importance that every word uttered by the team during the actual engagement be in Britannian. Any Japanese might direct suspicions back towards the 11 population, and to Shinjuku. As Tamaki checked the time on his cheap burner phone one last time, Naoto pulled out a flask of homebrew and carefully splashed it over the lapels of his jacket and on the front of his shirt, before wetting his palm with the liquor and rubbing it into the stubble on his cheeks and chin. Then, he took a small mouthful of the liquid and rinsed it through his teeth, wincing at the burn, before spitting it out in the direction of the cave-in. Between the off-kilter hat on dyed blonde hair, the open collar, the loosened tie, and the reek of alcohol, Naoto looked every inch the part of a dissolute Britannian junior officer drinking away the shame of the recent demotion betrayed by his freshly stitched lieutenant's bar. "Ready to go, everyone?" Naoto's voice was serious, as he looked from man to man. Tamaki mutely nodded, the anxiety and excitement starting to well back up in his gut now that the time had finally come. After a final round of nods all around, Tamaki carefully nudged the sheet of plywood aside and poked his head out of the station's mouth. After the hour and a half in the darkness of the station staircase, the outside world seemed bright under the illumination of the lights of the faraway core of the Tokyo settlement and the moon high above. Finding the broken pavement of the street just as deserted as it had been when they'd arrived, the group filed out of the station, Jin carefully propping the plywood sheet back into place. As soon as the sheet was back in place, Tamaki turned and followed Naoto, hearing Jin and Inuyama fall in behind him. The target was at least a half an hour away by foot, and they were now very much on the clock. Unlike the graveside of the rotting Tokyo Tower, the entertainment zone positively thrummed with activity. The streets heaved with drunken soldiers, government functionaries, and other representatives of the Britannian occupation, all drunkenly yelling, bellowing, and pushing in a scrum of consumption fueled by lust. Mixed into the crowd of eager customers were the inevitable followers, drawn by money so eager to be spent it was practically burning its way out of pockets and purses. Sausage salesmen did a brisk business behind sizzling carts on every corner, bouncers loomed in doorways of bars and brothels, and plenty of women and a handful of men of varying degrees of attractiveness in their skimpy outfits flitted and fluttered between knots of drunks, offering their wares and attempting to draw eager takers back to whichever house they were working out of. As the group entered the entertainment zone, Naoto's gait morphed from the firm and direct strides he'd taken on the walk to this little slice of soldier's heaven, instead rolling his steps and swaying side to side. The change was gradual, so it didn't jar any observant watcher, but by the time they'd made their way past the first block of late-night takeout joints and convenience stores, Naoto looked just as drunk as almost every other man on the street to Tamaki's eyes. Stopping at a sausage cart, Naoto ordered in slurred and near incomprehensible Britannian before shoving a wad of cash into the hapless honorary Britannian salesman's hand in exchange for 4 sausages and buns. As Tamaki waited for his turn with the condiment tray, Naoto squeezed the mustard bottle hard enough for the top to pop off entirely, dumping most of the contents onto his sausage and spraying mustard over the front of his uniform coat. Another bout of loud, slurred Britannian later, this one an angry tirade full of words Tamaki could recognize as profanity. Naoto had a second free sausage in hand and was staggering away from the cart, still streaked with yellow mustard. Playing the role of the nursemaiding orderly, Tamaki attempted to daub at the condiment stain whenever Naoto staggered his way and fought down the urge to grin at the sullen stream of Britannian curses coming from his friend. Bastard missed his calling as an actor. Well, at least he got us some dinner. As the small group of disguised resistance fighters moved deeper into the entertainment zone, the quality of the facades facing onto the streets improved. Bar windows were lined in fine, dark wood, undoubtedly concealing steel shutters and armor doors. The brothels became gilded enough to earn the description of bordellos, and most importantly, the number of men and women in the crowd wearing expensive finery increased the further Naoto led them into the zone. Hell, even the prostitutes are wearing nicer panties. That's straight up lingerie now, and that's just what the ones working outside are wearing. The group turned a corner, and Tamaki saw an illuminated sign featuring a single stocking-clad leg, the smooth white garment held up by a very elaborate, extremely lacy garter. That must be the target. The building the sign was attached to was about 100 yards down the block, and though the crowd was just as thick as ever, Tamaki could see a constant stream of well-dressed young men entering and exiting through the wide-open wooden doors. Even better, no obvious bouncers were in sight, reducing the chance of anybody getting in the way of the imminent fight. Naoto had clearly seen the sign too. Lowering his shoulders and picking up speed, the young half-breed bulled his way into the crowd, spitting a constant stream of slurred curses as he shoulder-checked one bystander after another out of the way. Tamaki and his 2 men picking up speed to follow Naoto through the gap in the crowd he'd cleaved. Ahead, a pair of visibly inebriated young men staggered down the trio of short stairs leading to the lacy garter's front door, laughing and swaying as they supported each other with friendly arms cast around shoulders. Judging by the short, tight, heavily brocaded jackets with long tails they sported, plus the tight trousers and knee-high boots, they were unquestionably nobles, and since they just emerged from a bordello owned by a purist family, Tamaki had no doubt that these 2 fit the target profile exactly. Fucking finally. The blood began to pound in Tamaki's ears, and he had to remind himself to stay cool and collected. It wasn't his role to get the party started, and the night's events were going to be an exercise in control, the attack a precise strike followed by a near-immediate disengagement. But I thought it had never come. But today's the day to get some fucking revenge. Dad? I'm sending some company your way tonight. Ahead, the 2 probable purists had reached the sidewalk. Tamaki could see they were talking, but over the noise of the street and the hammering pulse in his head, he couldn't make anything out. Fucking Brits are probably just bragging about how good they think they were in bed. Hope ya enjoyed it while it lasted, you murderin' pieces of shit. The world tunneled around Tamaki as he picked up speed, trying to maintain Naoto's acceleration. Cries of irritation and outrage doppelering out behind the group as Jin and Inuyama forced their way through the crowd behind him. The mood's already starting to turn ugly. Perfect. Naoto heaved his way down the street, and just as the purists turned towards the oncoming apparent drunk, Naoto dropped his center of gravity and slammed into the nearest purist, shoulder ramming into the center of the man's chest. The other noble cried out in pain as his right arm, still slung around his friend's shoulder, was painfully forced back in its socket as his inebriated friend staggered backwards, frantically trying to regain his balance. Tamaki came to a stop a few feet away from the two purists, and gestured for Inuyama and Jin to fan out to the left, into the crowded street and around the flank of the targets. As the two slipped off to the side, Naoto turned on his heel towards the staggering purist and began yelling, stepping closer and getting into the slightly shorter man's space. The other purist tried to stabilize the first, grabbing onto his shoulder as he leaned back, away from the spittle flying from Naoto's mouth and the overpowering stench of hard liquor wafting off Naoto's uniform. Tamaki didn't have a great understanding of Britannian, but between all the planning sessions and the rehearsals, he'd picked up enough vocabulary to understand when Naoto told the purists to get the fuck out of the way. "You purist cucks already got your shrimp dicks milked, so make room for me and my boys," gesturing towards Tamaki, who was doing his best to look as sober and stoic as possible and desperately hoping that Jin and Inuyama were doing the same. While the purists had at first looked stunned to suddenly be confronted by an irate drunkard they almost certainly outranked, the initial confusion had rapidly turned to barely suppressed anger. Fists clenched, they had admirably kept their anger under control, presumably because Naoto was clearly spoiling for a fight, and had tried to calm the situation down. Tamaki hadn't been able to understand the exact words, but he doubted the attempt at de-escalation would have worked regardless. The contempt in their tone was obvious. But, as Naoto continued the barrage of insults, the two seemed like they were actually going to force Naoto to throw the first punch, which would have ruined the broader plan of riling up the crowd against the purists. Just as Tanya predicted, however, the implication that the intoxicated fool yelling at them was about to lead a unit of honorary Britannians into a brothel specializing in Britannian prostitutes in particular was the one thing that the purists couldn't stop themselves from reacting, and the man Naoto had shoved took the bait and started yelling back just as angrily and stepping almost chest to chest with Naoto. "Oh, shut the fuck up, you noble twat. They're honorary Britannians, so they're just as good as any other fucking Britannian here. Better than some, since they can actually please a woman. Those girls won't have to fake their moans with my boys, ya hear?" Tamaki was impressed. Between Naoto's assertion and the shit-faced grin he wore, the purists looked nearly apoplectic, cheeks red and incoherent half-syllables choked out into the cold night air. Taking a quick look around, Tamaki saw that the little confrontation, noisy even by the standards of the entertainment zone crowd, had not gone unnoticed. A ring of men and women, of whom maybe 30% looked wealthy enough to be nobles of some kind and thus purists, had begun to form. The ring surrounded a small clearing in the crowd maybe 10 feet wide, with the two purists and Naoto near the center and Tamaki right near the edge. From the corner of his eye, Tamaki saw Jin standing in the ring, almost directly behind the purists, while Inuyama was one row back and to their right. With Naoto in front of them and Tamaki to their left, the pair were surrounded, though they hadn't realized that quite yet. The more belligerent of the two purists once again took the bait, although it was hard to hear what he was saying over the rising murmur of the crowd as more and more people converged on the ring. The crowd, however, did understand whatever the drunken lord had spewed out in response, and the murmurs from the non-purist soldiers was turning increasingly ugly, while the purists were cheering on their comrade. Which means the idiot probably said something about how the regulars can't do shit, or how they spend all their time with whores instead of doing anything useful. Fuck, it's just like Danya said it'd be. Before the purist could finish whatever verbal riposte he'd attempted, Naoto started shouting. Tamaki knew the gist of the comeback. "Bullshit. You purist bastards just run around doing whatever you want, stirring up shit, and then you swan off to your fancy clubs and stuff your piggy faces. And who the fuck cleans up your mess? We do. We do all the hard work, we do the dangerous stuff, and you bastards take all the credit." This time, the non-noble Britannians cheered, their drunken enthusiasm nearly drowning out the heckling from the equally drunken purists. Across the ring, Tamaki saw Inuyama move, and suddenly the purist in front of him in the ring itself fell forward and to the side, running into a regular soldier and trying to grab onto him for balance. The drunken soldier turned with a snarl, but before Tamaki could see what happened next, the purist pushing up against Naoto lost his temper and tried to shove him. The taller, stronger, and secretly sober Naoto swayed back with the shove, before reciprocating, shoving the drunken and enraged purist from the shoulders instead of the chest, sending the man sprawling. Tamaki distinctly heard the sound of the man's head bouncing off the curb, but by that point the chaos had already begun. The guy's friend swung at Naoto, who ducked the wild haymaker and shoved the man back as well. Unlike his friend, the second purist stayed on his feet, staggering backwards into the ring of bodies behind him, Naoto close on his heels. As the second purist fell back onto the arms of one of his comrades in arms, Jin stepped backwards, getting around behind the pair just as Naoto threw a straight right, missing his target but catching the other purist in the nose. Across the ring, the purist Inuyama had took a punch from the soldier he'd fallen on, who had apparently interpreted the fall as an attempt to shove him and had sunk his fist into the other Britannian's gut in retaliation. That purist had friends too, though, and the soldier was ineffectually trying to push his way back into the crowd, away from the two purists trying to grab him. One of the purists suddenly twisted in pain as Inuyama slammed a punch into his kidney, giving one of the soldier's friends the opportunity to jump in and grab for the purist's face as he turned. At that point, the ring and the crowd both dissolved into a melee of overlapping brawls. Most of the fighting was between middle to lower class Britannians, mostly in casual garb, though a few were still in uniform, and more richly dressed middle to upper class Britannians, but Tamaki could already see several scrums of men who all looked more or less the same to his Shinjuku eyes. Looks like lots of scores are gonna be settled tonight. Tamaki caught Inuyama's eye and jerked his head towards Naoto, and Inuyama nodded and began cutting his way through the heaving, brawling mass. Tamaki, for his part, rushed forwards towards the first purist, who after a few seconds of apparent unconsciousness appeared to be coming back around, trying to push off the ground. Tamaki bent down and scooped the still woozy man up into a firefighter carry, and started pushing his way towards the clear space between the wall of the lacy garter and the short staircase leading up to the door. Make way. Wounded man coming through. Make way. A small path through the fighters appeared and Tamaki hustled his way through to the open area. What happened? My head hurts. The man on his back moaned into Tamaki's ear, but Tamaki ignored him, and instead of responding carefully lowered him to the ground. As he bent down, he carefully put the man in the recovery position, kneeling beside him and rolling him onto his side, tuning out the slurred complaints. He's got a concussion at least, for sure. Then, as he bent over the downed man, making a production of propping up his back, Tamaki lifted the purist's jacket away from his back with one hand as he quickly rammed his hand down into his own pants and pulled out his knife, nearly cutting himself with the wickedly sharpened blade as the pressure from the belt turned the hilt in his hand. Before anyone could see what he was up to, Tamaki quickly stabbed the man twice in the back, aiming for the upper center of his back. The blade rasped against bone, and then as Tamaki pressed down firmly with as much weight as he could muster without tottering forwards in the second stab, he felt something give with a wet snap. Twisting the knife free of his patient, Tamaki quickly wiped the blade on the interior of the man's jacket before pulling the tailored garment back down over the wound. Tamaki was sure that the gurgling would have made the man's already slurred speech nearly incomprehensible to someone who could actually speak Britannian, but he was content with the indication that he'd gotten at least one lung with his knife. Tamaki manipulated the dying man's arms and legs so he would remain on his side, hopefully concealing the blood likely pooling under him until he and his comrades were well away, and got back up on his feet, tucking the knife against the inside of his forearm. As he turned, a momentary gap opened up in the crowd. Through the gap, Tamaki saw Naoto shove an apparent purist backward into Inuyama and Jin's arms. Inuyama grabbed the man's left arm, Jin his right, and as Inuyama grabbed the man's shoulder-length hair and pulled his head back, Jin's gloved hand flew across his throat, a wide red grin following in his wake. Below their feet, Tamaki thought he could make out another figure and bloodied brocade lying beneath their feet, before the crowd heaved again, closing the gap. A moment later, screams of horror began to resound through the crowd as somebody suddenly noticed one of the bloody bodies, and the earlier violence abruptly escalated as many more knives suddenly appeared from hidden sheaths, along with hurriedly broken bottles. Over the press of the crowd, Tamaki could see Naoto's dyed blonde hair, now minus the peaked officer's cap, moving with impressive speed through the crowd, followed by at least one head with a folding garrison cap. It's bug-out time, for sure. Tamaki started running, heading in the same southern direction Naoto had started to move. Since he was already near the edge of the mob, it was easy to break free and move. Naoto's longer legs had given him some advantage, and he broke free of the crowd a second later, Inuyama and Jin right behind him. Jin had already peeled off his bloody glove, though the right arm of his jacket was dripping and dark, and Naoto was furiously wiping away the splattered arterial blood from his face, not missing a pace as he continued to run. Tamaki fell into step, quickly shoving his knife through his belt, taking care not to stab himself in the thigh as he did so. Behind them, the screams of terror had already turned to howls of rage intermingled with pained cries. To Tamaki's amusement, though some people, including the sausage salesman, were following their lead and hurriedly getting as far from the area as possible, the yells and screams seemed to be attracting every wannabe belligerent in the area. Men and women, drawn by voyeurism, their own desire to end a night of fun by breaking someone's teeth, or summoned by cries for reinforcements, streamed past and in true Britannian fashion hurled themselves into the fight, seemingly without caring what the fight was about or how it had started. Tamaki wrenched his eyes away from a gang of 7 or 8 Britannians in the uniform of the Royal Marines, who were making a beeline back the way he had come with sleeves rolled up and an unmistakable expression of anticipatory relish. Forget about the damned Brits, you've got running to do. In a few minutes, he and his comrades would split up and make their separate ways back to the husk of Kamiyacho Station. Once they all got back, they'd have 4 hours or so to change back into their worker outfits, get cleaned up, and wait before heading back into Shinjuku. Tamaki would have liked to linger around the fight a bit longer. After all, it wasn't every day you got the pleasure of watching Brits beat the shit out of each other, but they'd done what they came for, and if he got caught after the job was done because he was rubbernecking, Tanya would never let him hear the end of it, if she didn't kill him herself. Would have been nice to see, though. But, hey, at least 2 of those purist fucks were definitely dead. Probably 3, that's a hell of a nice Christmas gift, right? Tamaki grinned as he ran into traffic, dodging around a car screeching to a halt. This was what he'd signed up for, at long last. After the attitude adjustment from Tanya, the volunteer work didn't seem useless, but it was kinda boring. Bringing a little taste of hell to the Brits, though, especially the night before one of their big stupid holidays. Merry Christmas, Dad, wherever the hell you are. Hope I made ye proud. For once. Private First Class Suzaku Kurugi, lately of His Imperial Majesty's 32nd Honorary Britannian Legion, 1st Brigade, 3rd Regiment, 1st Battalion, 2nd Company, stared at the charred thing chained to the stop sign, and felt the world sway under his feet. The limbs had been mostly burnt away, but the thighs and upper arms remained. In fact, it was thanks to these remaining appendages that the corpse still hung from the chains padlocked to the stop sign. The cherry red paint blistered and peeled yet still visible between the spread stumps. Suzaku didn't know the man chained to the stop sign personally, he'd never met the fellow, didn't know his name or whether or not he had a family that would miss him. He did, however, know exactly what that man sounded like when he had screamed from the depths of horror and pain, pleading for mercy, for help, for someone to do something. Nobody had, Suzaku included. Nobody had intervened in the slow torture and lynching of the man, nor of the other 2 honorary Britannians who dangled from traffic signs outside the 2nd Chuo Ward outpost, only half a mile from the checkpoint into the Shinjuku ghetto. And now, at 1 o'clock in the afternoon on Christmas Day, the curfew on the barracks had finally been lifted for Suzaku and his fire team, so they could clean up the rubbish from the previous night's incident, including the 3 bodies. It had all come as a complete surprise to Suzaku and the other members of the 3rd Regiment billeted at the outpost. When he had gone to sleep at around 10 the previous night, everything had been calm and tranquil. Most of his fellow honorary Britannians had been enthusiastic about the day off they'd been promised the following day, although Suzaku had volunteered to remain on duty as part of the skeleton duty force. He didn't have any friends or family to spend the day with, and the extra pay seemed like the better option. Suzaku had slept as restlessly as always, the unquiet ghosts of his past tormenting him as they did most nights. When he'd woken up to the sounds of gunshots, angry yelling, and hundreds of pairs of feet converging on his location, Suzaku had at first thought he was still dreaming. The scuttlebutt was that the instigating event that had led to everything else was a fight that had turned nasty in one of the entertainment zones scattered around Tokyo. At least 100 men from various units had been arrested for a variety of crimes when the military police, supported by the night police, had finally arrived on the scene to break up the growing brawl. Almost as soon as the police had arrived and begun to beat the crowd of unruly soldiers back into line, the purists on hand, none of whom, Suzaku was sure, had been arrested, had immediately started yelling about their fallen brothers. One of the dead purists had been killed by a bottle-wielding marine who had slammed a mostly full bottle of bourbon into the man's temple with enough force to cause internal bleeding. The guilty party had been quickly found and was sitting in the cells under the viceroy's palace. The other 3 purists, on the other hand, had been knifed to death, and the purists had immediately pinned the blame on honorary Britannian soldiers. Allegedly, some honorary Britannian soldiers had been seen fleeing the scene, but Suzaku highly doubted that story. As far as he knew, all honorary Britannian units had a strict curfew, and as tenuous as the honorary Britannian status was, Suzaku doubted that any of his comrades would have chosen to flaunt the rules by going out for a night on the town. Regardless, whether or not the purists had been killed by honorary Britannian soldiers, the reprisals had come almost immediately. Before the sun had even risen, disorganized mobs of purists and other Britannians had swept through the Chio, Chuo, and Ginza districts, grabbing every honorary Britannian soldier unlucky or stupid enough to be outside their barracks, including men unfortunate enough to be assigned to guard duty outside the fortified walls of the various outposts or assigned to policing the honorary Britannian neighborhoods. Nobody in Suzaku's unit had any clue how many had died last night, and the news was second or third hand at best. But Suzaku was inclined to believe the worst, considering what had happened next. Once the mob had butchered their first batch of scapegoats, the purists had turned on the barracks housing the various honorary Britannian units distributed across the city. Here, at least, at the second Chuo outpost, the Britannian officers commanding Suzaku's unit had confronted the mob through barred gates, telling them that the unit was under lockdown and nobody was allowed onto or off the installation. The crowd had heeded the Britannian voice of authority, and hadn't entered the base's grounds. To Suzaku's fervent relief, the unlucky gate guards, stuck on the other side of the hastily shut gates, weren't so lucky. Unarmed as all honorary Britannians were required to be, in uniform or not, the 3 men on duty too slow to escape back inside had been hauled out of the guard shack and into the street. Suzaku had woken at 5:30 when the mob had first arrived, and like the other 4 men of his fire team he'd watched at the window with growing apprehension as the gate slammed shut and as Major Humphrey, who commanded the outpost's 2 companies, yelled back at the mob through the steel slats. For a moment, when it seemed like reason and order had won, when it seemed like the system had ruled the day once more, and that peace would prevail over violence, Suzaku had relaxed. It's good to see that some Britannians really do believe in their duty. The system truly can be reformed from within with the help of good men like the Major. That moment of contentment, of a renewed sense of surety and confidence in his life's choices, had been brief. The mob, denied the opportunity to destroy the entire garrison in an orgy of slaughter, had instead opted to vent their bloodlust on the 3 unfortunates they had seized. They had started with clubs and knives, they had soon moved on to blowtorches looted from a machine shop nearby. The Major hadn't even stayed by the gate to watch. As soon as the mob had turned inwards on its captives and ceased attempting to breach the walls, he had turned his back and returned to his quarters. Suzaku had to be physically restrained by his squadmates. As soon as the first screams had risen above the ugly din outside the gate, he had gone for the door. He had to do something, anything. Dash to help the poor men, his comrades, suffering outside. Before he had managed to even get out of his shared barracks room, much less out of the barracks, the corporal in charge of his fire team had grabbed him, and together with his squaddies had wrestled Suzaku down onto his bed and pinned his arms and legs. Suzaku had screamed at them to let go, pleaded for them to let him help, let him try to save the men suffering outside whose screams he could not shut out no matter how much he tried, but all was for naught. The corporal screamed back that the men were already dead, that there was nothing he could do for them, and that trying anything would just get them all killed. And so, Suzaku had thrashed against his comrades and wept, unable to help, unable to escape the agonized screams coming through the closed window. The screaming had ended by 7 o'clock, but Suzaku had seen the dancing light of flames reflected against the white ceiling of his barracks room, and remembered the scent of other burning Japanese. I joined up so I'd never have to smell that again. After the conquest, after we surrendered, there was supposed to be peace, damn it. The Britannians won. We honorary Britannians followed every rule they gave us. So, why? His comrades had finally let go of him, now that there was nothing Suzaku could possibly do, but he still lay on his bed, staring upwards at the reflected flames, asking himself why it was so hard for people to live together in peace. By 9, a night police Glasgow and a detachment of military police had come by and cleared off any remaining members of the mob with an admonition to return home to your families. It's Christmas Day, for God's sake, go home and enjoy your day. The handful of purists still present among the crowd of rubbernecking civilians had been told to return to their duty stations or their homes. Once the crowd had dispersed, the police had mostly left, leaving a token pair of military police behind to maintain order at the request of Major Humphrey. Not once during their stop had the police shown any signs of interest in the 3 dangling bodies, nor even remarked on the piles of charred garbage piled up around the base of each sign. Hours later, the honorary Britannians were still locked down, still huddling fearfully in their barracks. From his window, Suzaku had seen several groups of Britannian civilians taking pictures with the grotesque remains of 3 completely innocent honorary Britannians sworn to the service of Emperor Charles and the Holy Britannian Empire. At least one group of children had even started trying to pull pieces off the dangling thighs of the man bound to the stop sign, but apparently that was where the police had decided to draw the line, and the children were sent away after one was smacked across the ear. As the lunch hour had begun, Suzaku approached his platoon's lieutenant and requested permission to go out and take the bodies down. The lieutenant, a Britannian, had lost his usual sneer, and instead looked pale. His hands shook slightly, and at the mention of the bodies, he had looked physically ill. He had nodded vaguely, said something about running the request up to the outpost's commander, and had left the cafeteria. Suzaku had joined his squad at their table, where they all sat in silence. Their lunches sat on their trays practically untouched. Nobody felt much like eating. Nobody had opted for the meat option that day either. Usually, Suzaku felt fairly isolated among his fellow honorary Britannians. Most of them had come from poor backgrounds, and had seen the honorary Britannian option as a way to a better life, and his background as a member of an upper-class family before the conquest marked him out as different. On top of that, most of his comrades were solely concerned with improving their own and their families' prospects, and cared little for the majority of their people, who were still considered mere 11s by the Britannians. They hadn't taken his talk of reforming the system from the inside for the betterment of universal justice and their people when he'd first joined up well. Most days, any interaction Suzaku had with his comrades was professional at best, and always curt. Today, Suzaku felt just as miserable as everybody else there. The corporal had even looked apologetic once he'd waved the other members of the fire team off him. When he rejoined his squad at the table, instead of trying to find a spot somewhere to wedge himself into, 2 of the guys had moved out of his way, clearing a place for him. Suzaku couldn't find it in himself to wonder or care about the sudden level of newfound acceptance. All he could think about were 3 men screaming on pyres, a nearby airstrike shaking the plateau as he sat on a crate of MREs, the charred wood crumbling under the impact. I swear. Suzaku, I swear. I'm going to obliterate Britannia. Was how little it all seemed to mean. An hour later, Suzaku's fire team had finally been given permission to tidy up the street, and now here he was, staring into the blackened sockets of a man he had failed to save. Just another time I've been too late, done too little. What do? I just want to save my people. I want them to live in peace. We can't fight this. We'll all die. But the visage, barely recognizable as human, was as inscrutable as any Buddha carved from stone. Suzaku knew he wouldn't find any answers printed across its flaking skin, no more than he would find answers in the dreams where his father came to visit him, but he just couldn't look away. Behind him, Suzaku heard the sounds of brooms and shovels at work, as the other members of his fire team dumped the garbage from the burn pile around one of the other signs into a wheelbarrow. Suzaku had dimly noticed multiple empty cooking oil containers as he'd crossed the road from the barracks. Likely, the mob had piled up anything even slightly combustible around each of the chained men, before raiding a local minimart and dumping every bit of oil they'd had in stock on the garbage and the men. The whole street reeked of an unholy mixture of burning garbage and overcooked pork. One of his squadmates suddenly lost an internal battle and started retching, dry heaving for lack of any lunch or breakfast to expel. Suzaku felt cold and numb, as if the unmistakable twisted expression of excruciating agony had been a spiritual analgesic. His thoughts ran in circles, incredulity warring with indignation with resignation. Is this Britannian justice? Britannian honor? The system worked just fine when it came to breaking up that brawl last night, and when the police decided to scatter the mob, they were able to do that without a sweat. The system worked well enough for the major to give an order and have it obeyed. So, why didn't the system work for these men? Where's the justice for them? From the moment Suzaku had realized that an independent Japan was a lost cause, he had resigned himself to living under Britannia's rule. From that moment on, he had done everything he could to execute what he saw as his duty, to do whatever he could to make the occupation as light and easy for the Japanese as possible, no matter how lonely and heavy the burden. He had done what he had to, so Japan would surrender quickly, before the cities were ground into rubble. He had done everything in his power as a civilian to try and make things better for his countrymen, what little that had turned out to be. Finally, Suzaku had decided to enlist in the honorary Britannian legions as an example to his countrymen. He had hoped that the only son of the last Prime Minister of Japan enlisting in the Britannian army would reconcile his proud people to the new order. Besides, the army was the one place where an honorary Britannian could plausibly gain respect and power. If he could accrue power and influence, he could start to change the system from the ground up. At least, that had been the plan. Is it even possible to reform the system in any meaningful way? It was far from the first time he had asked himself this question. If the law states that criminals have the right to a trial and to a sentence in line with the penal code, but this sort of thing happens anyway. Suzaku felt helpless, adrift in a dark sea. He had made his choices with the best of intentions, and at the time they had seemed like good decisions with solid reasoning backing them up. He had done everything the Britannians had told his people they needed to do to succeed in Area 11. I gave them everything I had to give, all for the prospect of being a loyal Britannian citizen and an example to my people. But if we give everything we can give, and this still happens, what's the point? Suzaku forced himself to look away from the face of horror, sighed, and started going to work on the padlock securing the body to the stop sign with a pair of bolt cutters he'd grabbed from the motor pool on the way out. It was true, he had made his choice, but he had made those choices as part of an exchange. He would serve Britannia loyally and faithfully, and in exchange Britannia would be loyal and faithful in its promise that anybody sufficiently loyal and strong could be a Britannian. It was too late to go back, too late to change his past, but that didn't mean the future was already set in stone too. Suzaku had boundless faith in the system. Anarchy and chaos fed upon itself, and left everybody poorer by the end. If the leaders who controlled the system were allowing and fostering anarchy and chaos, though, then it's no longer the system, it's just another form of chaos, dressed up in order's clothes. The thought was like a hammer blow, but Suzaku kept dutifully working as he mulled through the implications of it. Britannia was far too strong to fight. Japan would be under Britannia. Britannia as it was now was fundamentally unjust. The system needed to be co-opted and reformed. The system as it was now could not be reformed. We need a new system, with new leaders beholden to the rule of law. Suzaku kept that conclusion to himself. That night, as he listened surreptitiously to one of his squad mates' contraband crank-powered radios, which he normally would have complained about as a breach of the rules, he didn't say a word, not about the radio, and not about the speech Prince Clovis gave on the previous night's tragic incident. An investigation would be opened into the deaths of the three purists, apparently, and Prince Clovis was certain that disloyal rapscallions hiding in the uniforms of our dear little friends and brothers the honorary Britannians were responsible. Nowhere in his speech did the prince mention the tragedy of Christmas morning, nor did the regular news announcer mention the mob lynchings outside of warnings about unsafe roads near honorary Britannian neighborhoods and installations. Later that night, lying awake, Suzaku reconsidered his conclusion, ran through the day's events, and found that his resolve had returned once more. He no longer felt numb, in fact, he practically burnt with a new purpose. The only way I can reform the system is if I install a new leader to change it from the top down.